Den of Beasts 1. The city smelled of humans. That was no surprise to Black Nail, it was a scent he knew well, but its intensity was still almost overwhelming. The dark alleys and city streets reeked not only of their sweat and urine but also of their blood and shit. Black Nail grimaced in disgust as he slipped through the shadows along the edge of the street and past the other pedestrians. He stayed away from any light that shone out from nearby buildings. Even goblins knew better than to shit where they lived. Were the humans just lazy or were they too afraid to go outside? The black gloom of night lay thick over the city as Black Nail searched for some sign or scent of his tribe amongst the torrent of other odors that filled the streets. Try as he might though he couldn't detect anything. Mingled among the foul and the vile there were however some other more pleasant aromas. They were smells he couldn't quite place but were familiar nonetheless. Some of the scents were somewhat like stew but even more varied. Other smells reminded him strongly of bread or some of the treats Varhus and Geralt had occasionally brought him. These were so much more full and fresh in their aroma though. It brought back bittersweet memories of his life before he had been taken from the sewers. The sound of nearby whispering tickled his ears and Black Nail looked over to see the shadows shift at the entrance to the alley he was about to walk by. He frowned at what he saw within. Suddenly, figures dressed in rags burst from the alley and towards him. They ranged in size but some were far smaller than Black Nail. Before they could get too close though, he kicked one of them away, and growled at the rest. The human children gasped and fled in every direction away from him. The larger female he had knocked over quickly got to her feet and scrambled away. Black Nail smiled smugly. The pests had looked like they were just running past, but the hobgoblin hadn't been fooled. He knew they'd been targeting him, most likely for theft. Goblins played similar tricks on each other all the time. A good kicking was always the right answer. The hobgoblin moved on. His recent actions had caused some attention to be focused on him, but not too much. No one had died and he hadn't made too much noise. The humans of the city seemed to value their privacy, which suited Black Nail just fine. He was even far from the only person out and about in a hood and cloak. Occasionally, a larger group of armed humans would pass by. Anyone who got too close to them was hassled and shoved around. Black Nail had examined a few of these human packs from a safe distance. They wore no uniforms or other marks of identification he could see. He had even seen two of the groups meet and exchange insults and threats. They hadn't actually fought though, so while they weren't friendly they weren't enemies either. Black Nail suspected these were warriors from different tribes attempting to gain status through displays of might and bravery. It was easy for him to avoid them. They were noisy and he could hear them coming from a block away. If he had wanted to, Black Nail could easily have never even entered their sight. He was sneaky like that. The hobgoblin wandered the sprawling streets of the city for a while without finding anything of too much interest. He did however pick up two tails. Black Nail didn't look back but he had definitely been hearing the same steady sound of footsteps for the last few minutes. That was interesting, he wondered who they were. Black Nail suddenly swerved and walked into a dark alley to his left. There were a lot of dark alleys to choose from in this place. He then crouched behind a pile of junk and waited. Just as he had planned, two men soon stepped into the alley. They walked quickly towards his hiding spot as they scanned the shadows for signs of him. Black Nail frowned in disappointment. He didn't know them and they didn't smell of anyone he knew. They were probably just a pair of random stupid humans. With a sigh, the hobgoblin rose from his hiding spot and confronted the men who had been following him. There he is, the smaller one barked as he spotted Black Nail. His companion whipped around and pointed a long dagger at Black Nail's face. The hobgoblin just tilted his head to the side lightly and gave him a quizzical look. Give up your coins or we'll, he started to say, before Black Nail tuned him out and sighed again. These men were just boring thieving humans and no one important. They didn't even have swords or look tough at all. Oh well, it was to be expected. Thieves were the lowest of the low after all. The hobgoblin raised the sling he was holding at his side and launched a rock at the talking idiot's face. There was a loud crack as the stone smashed into the man's forehead and tore a bloody gash across it. The injured mugger staggered and began to collapse. Before he hit the ground, Black Nail was already moving. The hobgoblin shot forward as he drew his sword, and slashed at the second man. Wah, the man said as he fumbled for his own dagger. Black Nail's blade cut deep into his shoulder before his target could manage to draw his weapon. The man screamed shrilly in pain as his arm went slack and the dagger fell from his limp fingers. The disabled man tried to pull away from the hobgoblin, but Black Nail took a step after him and silenced his annoying blubbering with a second heavy chop to his neck. Black Nail then pulled off his right glove and leisurely reached down. With a satisfied smile he tore the unconscious first mugger's throat out with his bare claws. The man's flesh felt nice and squishy between his fingers as he squeezed. It was too bad humans didn't taste that good. The grinning hobgoblin then took a few seconds to listen for the signs of anyone approaching. It was soon however apparent that no one was headed over to check on the source of the brief scream, so Black Nail began rifling through his attacker's clothes for things to take as trophies. He found a few shiny coins and pocketed their daggers as well, before leisurely continuing on his way down the alley. He could tell no one was coming his way so there was no reason to hurry. A few minutes later Black Nail stepped back out onto one of the main streets. At this time of day there were only a few other people around, and none of them were looking his way. As he started walking deeper into the city his stomach gave a rumble, killing things usually made him hungry. He still had some smoked meat and nuts left in his pack, but surrounded as he was by such intriguing smells there was no way he was going to eat them. There were much better things around for him to sink his teeth into. Black Nail followed his nose in the direction the most delicious aroma was coming from. Soon he found himself moving closer towards one of the more crowded and well-lit areas of the city. Cautiously, he looked out from a shadowy alley to see what was going on. The street was wider here and stretched quite a distance in both directions. It was well lit by bright torches, and the open doorways of buildings that lined the street. What had to be hundreds of humans were walking around as they shouted, yelled, and did other annoying things that were too loud. Most of them wore rough cheap clothing and bore visible weapons, but not all of them. Black Nail also saw quite a few human females dressed in next to nothing, and some similarly garbed men as well. He thought they looked more than a little cold. Scattered around the street there were several other humans in much nicer and more colorful clothing walking around too. Usually they were surrounded by more than a few tough-looking escorts. They seemed to be higher status humans with their own warrior underlings. The hobgoblin still didn't see anyone he knew, so he looked past all the rather fatty and oily humans to see where all the wonderful smells were coming from. The most potent of the aromas seemed to be leaking from several large well-lit buildings with open doors. The problem was that lots of people were coming and going from them. Light and crowds of humans in close proximity were something the hobgoblin planned on avoiding however. Some of the smells were coming from booths or smaller buildings with far less people in them. Those looked far more promising. Hesitantly, Black Nail stepped out of the shadows and onto the dimly lit street. He forced himself to casually walk past all the loud men and women around him. As he moved, a few of the tough-looking men gave him glares, but they ignored him when he moved out of their way. Some of the skimpily dressed men and women looked him over curiously, but after he failed to meet their gazes they lost interest as well. No one appeared to notice anything off about him, so Black Nail relaxed, and even began to enjoy himself. Ha, he was so tricky. All these stupid humans didn't know he was right there in front of them. This was too easy. All it took was a cloak and the humans couldn't see him, and they sure couldn't smell him either. As he walked past a pair of chatting humans he sniggered in amusement. One of the women threw him a rude glare but kept walking. This only caused Black Nail to snigger harder. He was so amazing. Now he just had to find some food, and then locate his tribe. The hobgoblin scanned the nearby wooden booths. They were covered in delicious-looking treats, but at least one human was watching over each of them. Black Nail grinned smugly, that didn't seem like it would be a problem. The hobgoblin did a quick walk down the street and back to pick a first target. Eventually, he settled on a booth being operated by a fat man that appeared to be selling some sort of meat pastry. Their spicy and meaty aroma made his mouth water. Black Nail watched the man carefully for a few minutes from across the street. When he had the man's mannerisms down he made his move, and began his walk by of the booth. The fat man watched him approach from the corner of his eye, but seemed unconcerned. Black Nail was just another random person on the street. As he reached the booth the fat man looked up and away from the hobgoblin, towards a scantily clad woman who was walking by. Instantly, Black Nail's hand shot out and grabbed several pastries. Quick as a striking snake the hand then withdrew out of sight and back beneath his cloak. The hobgoblin picked up his pace ever so slightly and swerved to disappear into a nearby alley before the man even noticed anything was missing. Once safely out of sight within the alley the hobgoblin stuffed his face full of meat pies. They were so very delicious. Ugh, he couldn't eat them fast enough. They were just too good. Black Nail began coughing and choking as he fought down the urge to throw up from eating too quickly. That didn't stop him from devouring the last succulent pie as he shivered violently in excitement though. The delicious taste was worth it. After a few more dashes out to liberate food that wasn't being used Black Nail had filled his stomach. He then took a brief rest to let his stomach settle before continuing on his quest to find his tribe. It quickly grew even darker out as the hobgoblin searched the quickly emptying streets. Eventually, all the lights went out and all the humans disappeared. Black Nail cursed as he stood alone in the middle of a completely empty cobblestone street. During his search he hadn't managed to find any trace of Herat or the others. Well, at least he was in no danger of starving to death. With a tired yawn the hobgoblin decided to abandon his hunt for now, and find somewhere to sleep. After thinking it over for a minute he thought the best place to look was the area where he had first entered the city. Most of the buildings there had been empty and abandoned. They were also a little worse for wear but he didn't care. As long as they kept the rain and wind away it was fine. Black Nail's cloaked form slipped silently through the now pitch-black streets. The sky overhead was heavy with unseen clouds that blotted out the heaven's light. Even the hobgoblin had some difficulty seeing where he was going. His nose however worked fine. Soon, Black Nail was back where he had started earlier that night. He selected one of the nearby houses as his territory for the night. The one he had chosen was a squat wooden structure with a small upper floor. There was a hole in the roof but it was still mostly intact and would serve as a shelter. It was also the house that smelled the least of humans and rot. Unfortunately, it also smelled strongly of rats so Black Nail went around and urinated on the walls to mark the territory as his own. That would keep them away while he slept, and if not then he would simply not have to look very far to find some breakfast. The stairs up to the upper room had collapsed but Black Nail had no trouble climbing up using its remains. Once he was on the second floor he found the driest corner and set up his blankets. With that done he looked around and gave a satisfied nod. No humans would be able to sneak up on him while he rested there, and the rats probably couldn't either. When Black Nail woke up the next morning the sun was at its peak in the sky. So, it wasn't really the morning at all anymore. No rats, dogs, cats, or humans had disturbed his sleep. The hobgoblin got up and looked out of the nearby window. It only gave him a good view of the nearby empty alley, but he could see the sky as well. It was cloudy overhead and the sun was hidden but it was still far too bright for him to be comfortable going out. Of course his only other option was to stay in the ruined house for hours until it got dark, and see if the rats ever showed up. After thinking it over Black Nail decided he would be fine exploring the city as long as he stayed away from people. The city was a maze of shadowy alleys and narrow streets so it wouldn't be that hard to keep out of sight. Besides, he smelled something delicious and really wanted to taste it. Black Nail slipped his cloak back on and hopped down to the first floor. After looking around to make sure no one was around, he crept carefully outside and into the sunlight. He then decided the first thing he was going to do was find some breakfast. Hopefully, he would stumble across some clue to Herod's location as well. So Black Nail started wandering the alleys and back streets of the city. He saw a few people around, but he kept his distance from them, and they stayed away from him as well. The people of Dagger Point weren't known for their friendliness. Once he accidentally walked past a man covered in rags who was crouched under a ledge without seeing or hearing him. When the man unexpectedly spoke, Black Nail jumped up in surprise before dashing away. It wasn't his proudest moment, but that was how Black Nail found himself standing outside the back of a large colorful building. It was only 2 stories tall, but still was one of the tallest buildings around. It had a solid stone and mortar foundation and was solid wood above that. Unlike all the other buildings around, it seemed in good repair, and looked freshly painted. Most importantly, there was a rather interesting aroma wafting down from one of the second-floor windows, and there didn't seem to be anyone nearby. Feeling intrigued, the hobgoblin gave a quick look around before slipping over to the wall, and beginning to scale the outside of the building. His claws found purchase easily enough, and it didn't take him long to reach the window ledge. He hung below it for a few seconds and listened, but didn't hear movement in the room on the other side. Reassured, he slowly raised his head over the windowsill and looked within. His first thought was that the room on the other side was rather fancy looking. In fact, it was the fanciest room he had ever seen. The walls were dark red and luxurious wooden furniture lined the room. A huge carved wooden canopy bed dominated the center of the chamber. Red curtains hung from the bed's canopy and it was piled high with ruffled sheets and pillows. Black Nail, however, focused on the wooden stand just on the other side of the window that held a silver platter and a jug of water. The delicious aroma he smelled was wafting up from there. With an eager growl, Black Nail climbed through the window and crept quietly over to the tray of food. He eyed it critically for a second. There looked to be some kind of cheese, slices of red meat in some sort of sauce, and bits of fruit on it. They all looked tasty, but the cheese smelled so good he began to drool. He reached for the food with a happy smile on his face, but the smile slipped as he suddenly heard the sound of sheets shifting. "What's going on here?" a sleepy but smooth voice asked from behind him. Black Nail jerked in surprise, before quickly pulling his hood down further and raising a hand to hide his face. He then spun around towards the source of the unexpected noise. He was just in time to see the mass of blankets and pillows on the bed be thrown aside to reveal the form of a completely naked human female with long dark hair. The sheets slid down her body as she gracefully pushed herself off the bed and stood up, before glaring suspiciously at Black Nail. Much to his surprise, she didn't betray a single shred of fear at his presence. Luckily, she didn't appear to have a plate in her hands. Den of beasts too. Black Nail stared nervously at the woman who had appeared behind him. She was definitely completely naked, yet she was looking him over without a single hint of fear. The hobgoblin found it more than a little unnerving. She was in a room with a cloaked hobgoblin while totally undressed. Why was he the anxious one? "You're definitely not a customer. You'd never get in the front door, your clothes are too rough looking. My first guess would be a burglar, but who would be stupid enough to rob this place? Maybe you're a fan?" Although that also seems unlikely, she asked with a thoughtful frown. Black Nail considered drawing his blade and killing her, but quickly discarded the idea. She wasn't a physical threat and the worst she could do was make some noise, which was what was most likely to happen if he did attack. Instead, he snatched up the plate of food and prepared to make his escape. "Make no sounds, woman. If you make noise before I leave, I'll kill you," Black Nail told the woman as he took a small step back towards the window. The woman just smiled at his remark, and then stretched herself out provocatively. As she arched her back, her sizable chest heaved. "Since you apparently came in here without knowing who I am, I'll introduce myself. I'm known as Luphira, and surely you wouldn't want to hurt little harmless old me," she commented as she pouted playfully. Black Nail suddenly found himself growing quite uncomfortable. He was feeling things he wasn't used to feeling about humans. There was just something so very attractive about the sinuous way this human moved. He wanted to lick her. Wait, what? Black Nail shook his head to clear his thoughts. What was he thinking? All humans were pink and fatty. He must still have some of the female goblin scent on him, and it was confusing him. He took an unconscious sniff of the air in the room, and his nostrils were flooded with a weird flowery scent. As he fought a sudden urge to sneeze, a realization hit him. It wasn't the leftover scent of a female goblin that was confusing him, it was the sweet floral scent. It smelled somewhat similar to a female in heat. "You've intrigued me, you mysterious stranger. I don't get much in the way of excitement these days, and even for a thief you're oddly covered up. Not to mention your voice is just so chilling." It sent a shiver down my spine, the woman told Black Nail as she hugged herself and shuddered theatrically. Black Nail froze just as he was about to take another step back. Against his will his eyes were drawn to her trembling body. The dark-haired woman grinned smugly as she noticed his reaction. "Are you ugly? Is that why you cover yourself? You needn't worry. I can assure you that I've been with uglier men. I've seen it all, scars, deformities, and pock marks. You get used to them after a while, so these things don't turn me off. In fact, they can be exciting in their own way. Why don't you put that food down and come over here to amuse me for a while? It's early enough in the morning that we won't be disturbed," she told him suggestively. Black Nail was beginning to get a strange headache. He really wanted to stay and stare at this female for a while, yet at the same time he also felt an overpowering need to jump out the window and flee as quickly as possible. The woman noticed his hesitation. "No? How rude, you're making me feel unattractive. There must be something you want though, beyond a plate of food. I deal in more than just sex, you know. My clients also come to me for secrets and gossip as well. Maybe we can play a game? I'll answer one of your questions and then you can answer one of mine, she offered him. Black Nail found himself nodding, and he wasn't completely sure why. He wanted to find Herat and Cedar, but he suspected it would be very dangerous to stay here. Unfortunately, leaving would require him to take his eyes off of the woman. She smirked at his gesture of acknowledgement, then twirled around and leisurely strolled back over to the bed. Once there she sat down and leaned back in a relaxed manner with her slender legs tucked up beside her. Black Nail had to bite his tongue to fight the urge to sit down beside her. The scent was really messing with his head. Ask your question then, she told him. Black Nail hesitated for a second before answering. He really wasn't sure this was a good idea. Is Herat in SS this city? He eventually asked. The woman raised a finger to her lips and looked thoughtful for a second. The Black Snake? That's an odd question for a petty thief to ask. You just get more and more mysterious. I can't figure you out, and it's actually rather infuriating. However, since you asked, I'd be more than happy to answer, Luphira told him. Yes, Herat the Black Snake is in the city. Her arrival a few days ago was big news, and her activities lately have shaken the city. There will be blood in the streets soon, I think. A cool surge of relief washed through Black Nail, and he broke out into a pleased grin. He hadn't been certain he was even in the right city. For all he knew, there were dozens of human cities in this area. Actually, knowing he was so close to his goal removed a weight from his back he hadn't even known he'd been carrying. Plus, the blood in the streets thing sounded fun. Oh, it's my turn to ask a question now. Let's see, what should I ask? Well, since you've been terribly discourteous by not introducing yourself to a lady, why don't we start with your name? Luphira told him with playful disapproval. The first thing that occurred to Black Nail was that he should leave now that he had his answer. The second was that he should lie. Yet, another part of him didn't want to displease the woman. Besides, he still needed to learn exactly where Herat was. It was a big confusing city full of the weird distracting smells. My name is Black Nail, he answered reluctantly. Luphira let out a deep sigh and collapsed onto her side across the bed. She then gave the cloaked hobgoblin a pouty frown. That doesn't help me at all. Could you be any more confounding? You're making me so curious. I just can't stand it. Go ahead and ask your second question, she told him. Where in the city is Herat? He asked her. I don't know. I could get the answer for you, of course, but I'd have to get in contact with some of my people. I don't think you want to wait for that, she replied. Black Nail frowned. If she didn't know where Herat was located, then there was no point in sticking around. Now that he knew he was in the right city, he wanted to get right down to finding his mistress. The scent in the air was making him drowsy, and really clouding his thinking. He had to leave now, or he didn't know what he would end up doing. I'm leaving, he grunted as he spun around and walked over to the window. He didn't turn back in her direction until he was climbing out. Luphira was giving him a thoughtful look. When she saw him looking, she sat up and smiled at him again, in a way that perfectly exposed her bare chest. Must you leave? I'll just die of suspense if you leave me hanging like this. I had such great questions all thought out too. I don't get many unapproved guests, so please feel free to climb back through my window anytime, Black Nail the Mysterious. I'll have someone leave a tray of food out, and then we'll continue our little game, she told him with a wink. Maybe, Black Nail muttered as he tore his gaze away from her and forced himself to climb down the side of the building. The fresh air outside quickly cleared the haze from his head. Once down on the ground, he hastily slipped away down a nearby alley. Right before he was about to turn the corner and head out of sight though, he glanced back to see Luphira standing at her window grinning smugly at him. Her expression reminded the hobgoblin of a cat that had found a mouse to play with. He picked up his pace, if only to counteract the part of him that still wanted to go back and see what would happen. Once he was safely away from any possible pursuit, Black Nail relaxed, and then started wandering the city again. It was still light out, so as before he stayed away from other people. He stuck to the back streets and used his sensitive hearing to make sure no one snuck up on him. Just as he was beginning to despair of ever finding Herat anytime soon, he came upon a familiar scent. It smelled annoying, or more specifically like Kida. Black Nail smiled, he had never been happier to smell the greasy scent of a human. Eagerly, the hobgoblin began tracing her trail deeper into the city. As he moved through the winding streets, it soon became apparent that she wasn't traveling alone, a man was accompanying her. Black Nail couldn't place him, but he smelled sort of familiar, so he was probably one of Herat's men. He pulled his cloak tighter as he followed the trail past a pair of talking men. When he skulked past them, they didn't do more than glance his way. Soon, however, the scent led him out of the back streets and out into one of the city's main roads. Black Nail peered around a shadowy corner as he weighed his options. In front of him was a bright street full of people walking and talking amongst themselves. It was lined with stalls, and even a few horse-drawn carts were carefully making their way down it. Of course, this being Dagger Point, almost everyone Black Nail saw was tough-looking and armed to the teeth. The hobgoblin didn't really want to go out there. Not only would it be much harder to conceal himself while out in the street, but Black Nail was also pretty sure it would be much harder to follow the scent. There were a lot of people, food, and garbage out there. Not to mention the horses, which were horrid stinking beasts. He was also sure to draw unwanted attention to himself if he went around with his nose against the ground. Humans didn't usually do that in his experience. With a sigh, Black Nail stepped out into the street. He didn't really have a choice, it wasn't like he could just stay in the alley all day. If someone saw him he would just have to run away very quickly, or hope that they wouldn't care he was a hobgoblin. Of course, every human he had ever met had cared quite a lot. He clutched his cloak tightly to himself as he hurried through the street. Kida's scent had been fairly fresh so he scanned the nearby crowds for her as he walked. A man that was walking by suddenly veered into Black Nail and knocked him aside. "Out of my way, midget," the man said as he walked by. The hobgoblin was pushed sideways, and almost jumped out of his skin in surprise. He had to fight down his panic and resist the urge to draw his sword. Murdering the man in the middle of street would probably draw attention, even in dagger point. At least he thought it would. So, Black Nail just ignored him and quickly moved on. Besides, the man had somehow managed to drop his coin pouch into Black Nail's hands. As he hurried away the hobgoblin scanned the crowds. He didn't see Kida or anyone else he knew anywhere, so he hissed in frustration. Who knew Kida could annoy him without even being around? The crowds were beginning to get to him, and make him feel squeezed in at every side. He needed to get away and catch his breath, so he made a break for a nearby alley. Right before he slipped away he threw one last look back, and froze. There they were. He saw Kida, and what's his face the bandit. They were across the street looking over some things at a stall. As he watched they broke away from the stall and headed towards a nearby shop. As Black Nail stepped out to follow them he noticed a group of 5 men look up from a booth down the road. They stared after Kida for a few seconds, and then moved towards where she'd gone. The hobgoblin's eyes narrowed as he watched them with sudden interest. They were definitely moving like hunters after prey, with eager steps and a coiled focus Black Nail knew well. He was thus willing to bet they weren't friendly. This was a problem. As annoying as Kida was she was still part of his tribe, thus an attack on her was an insult to him. Plus, if she was killed he wouldn't be able to trail her back to Harad, or kill her himself someday. As he observed the men Black Nail tried to come up with a plan. Taking out 5 large fighters was well outside his abilities. He was very dangerous and they seemed like normal stupid humans, but 5 was still probably too many for him. Kida and her companion spent the next few minutes moving from stall to stall and down the street. She had always claimed the city was her natural environment, but Black Nail was unsurprised to see she seemed completely ignorant of the fact that almost half a dozen hostile-looking men were trailing her. Of course, those men were in turn completely unaware that they were being stalked in broad daylight through the busy city streets by a hobgoblin. Then the girl and her escort headed off the main street and down a back alley. The leader of the thugs barked an order at his minions, and the group split up. The leader took one of his men and rushed ahead, while the last 3 continued following Kida. Black Nail grinned with vicious glee as he watched them separate. This made the odds much better. The hobgoblin stalked after his new prey. His former nervousness faded away and instinct took over as the excitement of the hunt warmed his skin. The mobs of chattering people around him stopped being possible enemies and instead became part of the camouflage that hid him from his quarry. Life was now so simple for him. All he had to do was outwit his opponents, and then he would get to taste their sweet blood. Nothing else mattered but the chase and its inevitable end. As the 3 slower-moving bandits slipped into the alley Black Nail was right behind them. He crept along without making a single noise but the quiet beat of his excited heart. He tracked them more by sound than sight, as he slipped from shadow to shadow and hid behind trash and the occasional crate. The men didn't seem too concerned about being followed though because Black Nail never even saw them look backwards to spot a tail. They were typical stupid humans who thought they were safe in their city, but they weren't. Black Nail had to stifle a vicious cackle. As they moved into a particularly dark alley that was surrounded on all sides by tall rough-looking wooden buildings one of the men fell behind the others a bit. Black Nail sensed opportunity, and made his move. He picked up his pace and silently closed the distance. Just as the other 2 thugs turned a corner Black Nail descended upon the unsuspecting third man's back. Black Nail's target must have heard or felt something because for a split second he slowed and began to turn his head. That was the wrong thing to do. Before the man even managed to turn around Black Nail had a dagger against his throat. An unnoticeable moment later blood poured from the man's neck as Black Nail's blade slid across it. The thug began to choke and stagger as red seeped down his body, but Black Nail wasn't looking. He had already bounded after the other 2. He had to kill them before they noticed that their herdmate was gone. The hobgoblin could hear his prey's footsteps so he knew it was safe to turn the corner. He rushed around it and saw the other 2 thugs. They were peering ahead as they walked, and intent on keeping up with Kida. "I hope Balstein lets us have some fun with the redhead before we kill her," one of the thugs whispered to the other. The only reply he got was a stern disapproving look as the other man shushed him. Apparently, they actually thought they were being stealthy or something. Black Nail almost sniggered in amusement at the thought. They were about to learn what being sneaky was really like. It would be a very brief lesson. The hobgoblin put on a burst of speed and reached out to grab the back of the first man's shirt. He twitched in alarm as Black Nail pulled him backwards, and then rammed a dagger up under his ribs. "Oh shit, what the hell's," the second thug cursed as his companion staggered forward. His eyes were wide with alarm and he reached for the dagger at his side. Black Nail however was already drawing his sword, and quickly launched a violent slash at the man. His opponent managed to dodge under the blow though, and draw his own weapon. Black Nail's second slash was blocked by a hastily raised dagger, so Black Nail stepped forward and kicked the man in the chest. The thug was sent flailing backwards, and hit the ground hard. Sensing his opportunity the hobgoblin stepped forward and stomped on the man's hand. The man shrieked and the dagger slipped from his hand. Black Nail grinned and hissed savagely as instinct took over. He then dropped his weapon and jumped on the thug. As he landed he grabbed the stunned man, and to make sure he stayed that way he then head-butted him. There was a quiet crack as the hobgoblin's forehead smashed into his opponent's face. The movement also placed Black Nail in just the right position to tear his prey's throat out with his teeth. The man flailed weakly beneath Black Nail as the hobgoblin bit down on the flesh of his neck, and tasted the iron of his blood. A few seconds later, after his prey stopped struggling, Black Nail sat back up and sighed happily as he licked his lips. Humans didn't taste all that good, too fatty, but there was nothing like catching your own food. Unfortunately, he knew he didn't have time to savor his victory. He had to follow Kida and make sure the two thugs who were left didn't kill her. Black Nail had gotten a good look at the men and he didn't think even odds favored Kida. The bandit leader looked dangerous, and Kida just wasn't. Black Nail took a quick second to loot the bodies of their weapons and baubles. Then, he hurriedly cleaned himself off and restarted his pursuit. Just as he caught sight of his trippy mates, they came to a stop. Black Nail snuck up closer to get a better look at what was happening. Then, he crouched and hid behind a barrel that was up against one of the nearby dirty alley walls. Up ahead of him at the other end of the alley, the two other thugs had stepped out from a side street to cut Kida and the other bandit off, and they'd brought reinforcements. They'd somehow managed to find another man and a tall lanky woman to back them up. Black Nail hissed in annoyance. Why did they think they needed so many warriors? As far as these stupid humans knew, they had already outnumbered their prey by quite a bit. Weren't two more fighters kind of overdoing it? The dangerous-looking scarred leader of the thugs drew his sword and pointed it at the man by Kida's side. He had an eager gleam in his eyes Black Nail didn't like. The hobgoblin's two trippy mates drew their own blades in response. What do you think you're doing? We're part of Herad's band, and under her protection, Kida's companion told them confidently. Oh, we know. That's why we're going to kill you. We serve the wolf, and Warwick wants your bitch of a leader dead. I figure killing you two is a good start. Besides, no one is going to miss a few grunts. People stumble over the corpses of weak fools in Dagger Point every day, the scarred man replied. Then, he lunged forward and slashed at Kida with his sword. The young woman attempted to block the blow, but wasn't fast or skilled enough. Her sword was sent flying out of her hands, and she yelped as the blade whirled past her face. Black Nail hissed in frustration. Even if he thought that he was a good enough fighter to turn the odds around, and he wasn't, he was still too far away to reach them in time. Surprise attacks were very different than face-to-face sword fights. He wouldn't be able to get a clear shot with his sling either. There was nothing he could do beyond what he already had. As he watched, two of the other thugs moved to attack Kida's nervous-looking companion. Their leader grinned savagely as he stepped forward to finish the now unarmed young woman off. As his blade slashed towards her, Kida's eyes went wide with fear. Den of Beasts 3. Shit. Kida swore as she threw herself out of the way of the blow at the last second. She rolled awkwardly over the dirty cobbles of the road, but somehow managed to escape unharmed and land in a low crouch. As her attacker delivered a follow-up slash, she scrambled backwards, and the blade grazed her shoulder. The wound bled profusely but looked shallow, so Kida wasted no time in drawing her daggers and snarling at her attacker. The scarred man apparently wasn't impressed though, because he just gave her an amused smirk. Ha, what do you think you're going to do with those tiny little, he started to say. Before he could finish though, Kida whipped one of her daggers at his chest, and the startled man had to dodge to one side. It only took him a second to recover, but that was all Kida needed to draw another dagger and put some more distance between them. Black Nail took advantage of everyone's preoccupation to clamber up the side of the wall beside him. Once up on the roof, he laid low and began to inch his way closer to the fight. If he managed to get closer, maybe he could end the fight with a sneak attack. Kida's companion was warding off his own attackers with defensive swordplay, but was slowly being pushed back. Neither he nor his opponents seemed too eager to close in on each other. Kida threw a glance at her comrade as she took a few more steps back, and then looked at the empty alley behind her. Her scarred opponent just continued grinning smugly, and didn't bother chasing her. Don't even think about running. I have men positioned to cut you off the second you try it. You're trapped here, the thug's leader bragged loudly enough that it echoed down the alley. He then smiled viciously and looked expectantly at the end of the street. Everyone else followed his gaze as well, including Kida. Several seconds went by, and the man's smile slipped from his face. That means you should come out, you bloody idiots, he shouted with an exasperated tone. Several more seconds went by as everyone stared towards the end of the alley. No one moved, and the only thing anyone heard was background sounds from the city. Nothing happened, and no one appeared from around the corner of the street. Eventually the silence was broken by the sound of snickering. Are you ever right about anything? Kida asked the scarred man with a roll of her eyes. Shut up and run, the man who had been fighting beside her said as he made a break for it. Kida took his advice. She quickly threw another dagger at the enemy closest to her and then took off as well. After a brief moment of shock, their attackers gathered their wits and ran after them in pursuit. Where in all the hells are the others? Their leader asked sourly as he ran. None of his men had an answer for him. Black Nail knew, but he, obviously, wasn't telling. Instead, the hobgoblin just watched the action from his rooftop perch. Unfortunately for Kida, it looked like the tallest of the thugs was a good runner. He was quickly closing the distance between him and his quarry. Black Nail was looking down as they ran below him. He sighed. Stupid Kida couldn't even run properly. He wasn't about to let her, or what's his face, die though. Her death would waste all the effort he had already put into saving them. So, Black Nail drew his sling and sighted on the fastest of his tribe's enemies. As the weapon's crack filled the air, he ducked out of sight again. A scream of pain filled the air, and was quickly followed by a crashing sound as the man tripped and rolled into a pile of large wooden crates. Black Nail sniggered in amusement from his hiding spot. Humans had such terrible senses. Bloody fucking hells, the hobgoblin heard his target swear between grunts of pain. It sounded like it hurt a lot, which was good. The tall man's noisy crash had distracted and slowed his fellows as well. The scarred man was livid and red with rage as he turned toward his fallen subordinate. You bloody idiot! How'd you manage to trip over yourself? Now we're going to lose them. What's wrong with you morons? First, the others apparently get lost somewhere, and now this, their leader growled angrily. I didn't fucking trip, boss. Look at my leg. It's a bloody mess. Something hit me, the downed man replied between labored breaths. As if. There's no one here but, the scarred thug began to reply. Black Nail had stopped listening. Once he'd confirmed that his tribe-mates had gotten safely away, he'd rolled over the roof and climbed down the other side of the building. He had to follow Kida and the other man back to their base before they got too far ahead of him. The hobgoblin dropped down back onto the street and raced around the shabby building at the corner. Once he reached the entrance to the side street, he caught their scent again, and he took off after them. He was tired of wandering the city. He wanted to find his master already. By dashing frantically, and ignoring the stares of the people around him, he closed the distance enough that he could hear his quarry. Their running footsteps stood out in this quieter part of the settlement, so Black Nail was able to follow that noise even from a street behind them. They led to him to a large sturdy-looking building that was located right against the eastern section of the city wall. It formed a compact compound with several smaller buildings that surrounded it. As he closed in, the hobgoblin smelled the scent of familiar people. The rich earthy tones of the forest still clung to some of them. This was definitely the right place. Black Nail's ears suddenly twitched as the sound of voices he recognized reached them. One of them was just Kida, but the other was definitely Herad. He'd found her. The hobgoblin grinned happily as he realized his long journey was finally over. The sound of the conversation was coming from a nearby window, so he bounced joyfully over to it. Then, he looked around to make sure he was unseen and stopped to listen. It was best not to surprise them by entering unannounced. Lucky we escaped at all. If I wasn't so good with my knives they would have had us, Kida said. It sounds like you were more than lucky. Both of you should still be back there in that alley, as corpses. It's more than a little odd that their reinforcement didn't show up like that, Cedar's voice replied. That's not important. I'll have their hides for this. I can't believe those bloody fools dare move so openly against me. This could mean war, hissed the infuriated voice of Herad. Black Nail winced and cringed at the anger in her tone. He'd been about to slip into the room and take credit for saving Kida, and that other guy, but now he hesitated. He didn't really want to approach Herad right now. He wasn't, technically, supposed to be in Dagger Point after all. No one had actually forbidden him, but it didn't sound like Herad was in the mood to argue the point. There was no harm in waiting a bit. They must have something planned. This doesn't sound like a subordinate getting out of hand. They wouldn't risk this if they weren't sure of their victory, Cedar said calmly as Black Nail resumed listening. It must be those fuckers Fang and Galive. The rumors that Zelena managed to buy them off must be true. That means Warwick's bitch has turned over half the larger bands against me. They're not afraid of a war because they think they'll win, Herad speculated darkly. That would be bad. We've recruited some more men, but not nearly enough to fight so many other bands. We also don't much in the way of allies among the other chiefs. Several of them wouldn't turn against us, but they also wouldn't fight Warwick for us either, the old scout told her. Then I'll have to kill Fang and Galive. That will serve as a message to the others, plus it will be very satisfying, Herad said. Sounds like a great plan, but I don't see how it would ever get done. Both of them are veteran bandit chiefs, so they'll have measures in place against killers. Word on the street is the first thing Zelena did when she got here was buy the services of all the best assassins, anyway. With all the money she's been throwing around I doubt you'll be able to turn any of them, Cedar commented. I could call them out, and cut them down myself, Herad replied with more than a hint of frustration. I doubt they'd go for that. We probably won't see heads or tails of them until they swarm over us like ants, Cedar told her. You're not here to tell me what I can't do, Cedar. Come up with a solution. You must have contacts or something that will help. I brought you here for a reason, not so you could whine. Herad hissed at him. I'll see what I can come up with, Cedar answered stiffly. Black Nail heard the sound of footsteps as his master left the room. He was fairly confident that now would be a really bad time to approach Herad. He didn't want to wander the city forever though. So, he needed a way to get into her good side, if such a thing actually existed. It had to be something that would impress her enough that she would welcome him, and set aside the issue of whether he was really supposed to be in Dagger Point or not. Only one thing came to mind. He would present her with the severed heads of her enemies. That meant he had to kill the men known as Fang and Galive, or at least one of them anyway. No one could possibly stay upset after receiving such a great present. Herad would love it. The only problem was that he had no idea where to find those men. If wandering the city for the past day had taught him anything, it was that Dagger Point was a hard place to find someone. Threatening random people until they told him what he wanted to know would probably take too long. It would also attract attention, and thus be more than a little dangerous. How else could he find those men though? Black Nail frowned as a troubling answer occurred to him. He had met one person who apparently knew where people could be found. He didn't really want to go back there, but he didn't see any other option. He would have to be very careful if he talked to her again. The hobgoblin sighed and slipped away from his tribe's new home. It took him a while to travel stealthily through the back streets and arrive at his destination. As he stood outside the large building he eyed the window he'd climbed through earlier warily. Should he just climb through again? Should he just leave? The tiniest hint of the spicy perfume from his first visit tickled his nose, and his heart quickened. A desire to seek the source of the aroma began pulling him towards the building. Black Nail snorted violently and shook his head in an attempt to clear it. With a sign of resignation he then crept back over to the window and carefully climbed up the face of the wall. Once again, he listened carefully for a minute before entering, but once that was done he swung himself through the window and landed on the floor. This time as he scanned the room he made absolutely sure he was alone. There was no one hidden among the sheets or anywhere else, so he relaxed. The room being empty did present him with another problem though. What was he supposed to do now? Just wait for Lupira to come back? He stood on the center of the room for less than a minute before he gave up. If she wasn't going to come to him then he would have to go find her. Black Nail tiptoed over to the entrance on the far wall of the room, and placed his ear up against the door. It was a large building and he could hear several people moving through it, but none of them seemed to be in the next room. Feeling reassured he reached out and pulled the door open slightly. Or at least he tried, it didn't actually move. With an annoyed grimace the hobgoblin pulled on the doorknob slightly harder. The door still didn't budge. He hissed in annoyance and stared at the polished bronze handle. Was it locked? He gave it another tug, before frustration overwhelmed him. He stepped back and growled at the offensive metal protrusion. The urge to smash his way through the door in front of him was getting harder and harder to ignore. Just then he heard noise from the room on the other side. He froze and his ears perked up as he listened. Someone was approaching. No, make that two people. He definitely heard two sets of footsteps. A panicky twitch went through him as he instinctively looked around for somewhere to hide. He shook the reaction off though, and started planning. Hiding somewhere in the room would be stupid, he needed to talk to Lupira. Just as he was thinking of her, Black Nail picked up the sound of her voice from the other side of the door. It sounded like she was the closer of the two people to the door. He grinned as he instantly decided on a course of action. With sudden calm the hobgoblin strolled over to stand behind the door, and waited to see what she did. He was momentarily distracted from his scheme as the doorknob turned and the door opened. He stared at the bronze handle in surprise. So that was the secret to the human's nefarious goblin-proof door. I have a delightful red wine that I think, Lupira said, before faltering as the door she was pushing open hit Black Nail's boot and came to an unexpected stop. She froze and the hobgoblin could practically smell her hesitation hanging in the air. The woman's black hair cascaded over her face as she slowly peered around the door. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Black Nail's cloaked form. The hobgoblin just smirked beneath his hood and raised a hand to make a shushing gesture. Lupira gave him an annoyed glare then turned back around and addressed the person behind her. You know what? Why don't you stay here for a second, while I attend to some brief chores? Just make yourself comfortable out here, she said before quickly stepping through the door and closing it shut behind her. As she moved into the room the hobgoblin noticed that she was wearing clothes this time, although not a lot of them. She wore a flimsy-looking white gown that was almost transparent. It didn't seem very practical or warm, so he wasn't sure why she bothered. As he watched her the woman gave Black Nail a scowl, and then walked over to the bed while motioning for him to follow. Black Nail did as she asked and moved away from the door. I can't say I expected you back so soon. I'm honestly not sure if I'm pleased or annoyed. If you're here for more answers you'll have to be quick, and willing to pay my price. I'm currently in the middle of another piece of business, and he's rather handsome, she told Black Nail with a confident smirk, which went right over his head. Yes, I want answers to new questions, the hobgoblin replied. Oh, so you found Herad did you? She asked. I did. Now I must find two men known as Fang and Galive, he told her. Her eyes narrowed and her head tilted in response to his words. She looked thoughtful. I'm sensing a pattern here. What could you possibly want with the locations of 3 bandit chiefs? Before I answer your question I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to answer mine, she told him. It was Black Nail's turn to scowl now, as he considered his options. Once again though, he didn't seem to have much of a choice. She clearly had the advantage when it came to this game of answers. Should he lie though? The problem with that was he didn't know what an effective lie would even be. Very well, I will answer first. I wish to serve Mistress Herad, and so I seek a gift for her. I will give her the men known as Fang and Galive, Black Nail replied. If she didn't like his answer he could always just jump out the window, or kill her. Maybe it was the flowery scent in the air, but she was looking unusually tasty for a human. Lupira didn't overreact to his answer though, she just looked thoughtful. She murmured something to herself, before giving him an appraising look. Black Nail relaxed in response. You plan on killing 2 of the local bandit chiefs, by yourself? That won't be easy, she told him. They're only human, Black Nail replied with a shrug. True enough, I guess. I find it's a common flaw in most the people I meet. Anyway, my time's running short so I'll answer your question for you. I've never been a fan of either of those butchers anyway. If you manage to kill them, and not before, feel free to return and we'll have another lovely chat, she told him dismissively. Black Nail grinned at her choice of words. They were more than a little amusing and he totally agreed. Cedar had told him to always say thanks when someone gave him something, including information, so he did. Thank SSU, he replied as he fell deep into thought. He couldn't understand this woman at all. Usually, humans were very simple creatures. They liked coins, and they didn't like being stabbed. Lupira was more complicated than that though. Her lack of fear confused him. Black Nail also had the distinct impression that she had been pleased by how the conversation had gone, but was trying not to show it. After Lupira quickly explained to the hobgoblin how to find both of the men's lairs, Black Nail took his leave. He hopped out the window and quickly climbed down the outside face of the building. Den of Beasts 4. Once he was back out on the street, the hobgoblin broke into a jog, and swiftly headed towards the first of the locations Lupira had told him about. The man named Fang apparently lived in the northern part of the city. His lair was atop a place where humans bought drinks. He had been told it would be easy to find, but full of guards. If they were anything like the other men that lived in the city, then Black Nail doubted they would be much of a problem. The hobgoblin traveled through the back alleys most of the way to Fang's tavern. Only when he got close to his destination did he emerge from the shadows, and walk out onto one of the more crowded main streets. He kept his hood up as he scanned all the nearby buildings. Almost immediately he found what he was looking for. The left side of the street was dominated by a large building that towered over the rest. It was a huge sprawling structure with 2 wings that protruded from either side. The central part even had 3 floors, and a wooden balcony. Most of the buildings in this city weren't nearly that tall. Quite a few people were moving in and out of the front entrance, and a clamor of human voices could be heard from within. Humans apparently liked to yell a lot while they drank their foul poisons, or maybe it was only the louder and stupider humans that drank it. Black Nail was sure he was in the right place because a wooden sign, with what looked like a long bloody troll's tooth painted on it, hung over the tavern's door. Lupira had told him to look for that symbol. This wasn't a building he could just walk into though, because 2 of the largest humans he had ever seen stood outside the entrance. They were obviously guards of some sort, because everyone who entered had to stop and speak to them first. Every once in a while, the pair of giants would turn someone away and force them to leave. Black Nail didn't think he could bluff his way past them. There were also too many people around out front for him to try and sneak in. He even saw several humans at windows who were obviously sentries of some sort, and one man who was loitering across the road was already glaring at him suspiciously. Undaunted, Black Nail started walking down the street until he was out of sight of anyone watching. He then briefly scanned the crowd to make sure he wasn't being followed, before slipping back into the maze of shadowy alleys that bordered the main streets. He then worked his way around to the rear of his target's base. It wasn't long before he began to notice small patrols of humans wandering around. He could hear their footsteps as they walked back and forth through the alleys. Fang must have sent them out to protect himself, but they were no threat to the hobgoblin. He easily avoided them or hid as they moved past. He also quickly spotted several men and women in the windows of nearby buildings. The way they kept looking around at the streets below identified them as more than casual observers. These sentries were more trouble for Black Nail than the patrols were. The hobgoblin was sneaky, but he wasn't invisible. He marked their positions as he circled the compound and looked for a way in undetected. It took him a while to find one. Whoever had posted the sentries had known what they were doing, but Black Nail knew he could find a flaw in any defense if he looked hard enough. That was especially true for any defense made by mere humans. Black Nail grinned to himself as he watched one of the sentries from around a corner. Most humans weren't nearly as smart as they thought they were. After a few minutes of searching, the hobgoblin managed to sneak right under the nose of the sentry. The woman was watching the street from a second-floor window, so Black Nail slipped through the front door of her house and then right out the back. His ears and nose had told him there'd only been the one person in the house. Black Nail then crept past the smaller buildings and wings, as he moved towards the largest building. He'd been told Fang lived on the top floor of it. Black Nail moved slowly enough that he could hear anyone before they saw him. He had to be super sneaky now. There were a lot of men wandering around the area. It would be bad if he stumbled into them. When he got to the central building, the first thing he did was find an empty second-floor window, and then he hid himself behind a row of barrels in the alley directly below it. Once he was out of sight, he closed his eyes and began to concentrate on listening. A multitude of voices echoed through the building, but almost all of them were in the large room on the first floor just past the front entrance. The second floor was much quieter, with only the occasional noise as someone spoke or boards creaked under people's feet as they moved. The third floor was utterly silent as far as Black Nail could tell. He couldn't have asked for a better setup. He waited for several minutes before making his move. He had to be sure that no one was looking his way or near a window, before he started scaling the wall to get inside. He was aiming for a second-floor window because climbing all the way to the third floor would leave him exposed to any watchers. None of the surrounding buildings were taller than 2 stories. It was easy enough for him to quickly scramble up the side of the building and pull himself through the window and onto the second floor. Once he was inside the empty hallway on the other side of the window, he crouched down and listened again. He still didn't hear anyone nearby, so he got up and began to look for the way up to the third floor. He exited the hallway and walked into some sort of wide eating room full of tables, chairs, and other furniture. Most the room was dark and smelled strongly of many different types of food. None of the scents were fresh though, and after a brief exploration, Black Nail didn't find anything worth eating. Reluctantly, the hobgoblin stopped looking for a snack and went back work. He would just have to get a bite to eat when he was done. As he was crossing the room, he heard the creaking of floorboards, so he dashed off to one side and hid himself under a nearby table. Moments later, a smaller man walked briskly through the room and then disappeared through the far door. When the man was gone, Black Nail crawled out from under the table, and resumed his search for the way up. He found it several minutes later. Off to one side of the building there was a staircase that led upwards. Black Nail smirked eagerly as he carefully crept up the stairs and towards his target. At the top of the stairs there was a door. Black Nail stopped and stared at it for a moment before tentatively reaching out and grasping the doorknob. First, he tried to push it. That didn't work, so next he gave the door a slight pull. When that didn't work either, his stomach turned nervously. He only had one more shot at this. Black Nail held his breath as he attempted to twist the handle. There was a muted click, and he almost jumped out of his skin in alarm, as the door slid open slightly. He froze and listened just in case someone had heard something, before sliding through the doorway. He couldn't help chuckling quietly to himself as he moved. He'd successfully defeated the clever human lock. Had there ever been a smarter hobgoblin than him? He doubted it. Expensive furniture lined the small room on the other side. It didn't seem as nice as the pieces in Lapira's chamber though, or as organized. Some of the furniture clearly didn't match, even if it all looked fancy. There certainly was a lot of it though. The walls were even covered in pictures drawn on rectangles of various sizes. Black Nail walked up to one of the pictures and examined one. He had seen similar things before, but never really had an opportunity to look at one closely. This one seemed to be of a man's face. It was really quite realistic. Black Nail had no idea how humans made things like this. Was it some sort of magic? The hobgoblin reached out and gently poked the portrait. He was somewhat relieved when his finger hit the flat canvas. For a second there he'd almost been afraid there was a real person in there or something. That would have been awkward. With his curiosity satisfied, Black Nail moved away and explored the room. There was only one other door in the chamber, and after failing to find anything worth collecting he went over to examine it. He grinned confidently as he turned the door's handle, but nothing happened. The handle wouldn't turn. Black Nail hissed angrily as he clenched his teeth. Why wouldn't it turn? The stupid thing must be broken. As he went to try and give the handle another twist he noticed a tiny hole in the door above it. He stared at it for a second, before realizing that it reminded him of the locks he had seen on chests. The door required a key. No wonder he couldn't open it. Apparently, the stuff on the other side of this door was super important, because it not only required one of the turning puzzle locks but a key as well. Black Nail thought that was overkill, and more than a little unfair. He'd had a key once, but he'd given it to Cedar. How was he going to get past this door now? Fang's room undoubtedly lay on the other side of it. He was just about to try shoving random stuff into the keyhole when he heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs behind him. Black Nail stepped away from the door and frantically searched the room for some place to hide. Should he hide behind the chair? No, too visible. What about in the chest? No, too uncomfortable. The thud of footsteps grew closer until it reached the top of the stairs. Black Nail had no more time to waste, so he quickly threw himself behind a long padded sofa. He just really hoped whoever was coming up the stairs didn't look too closely in his direction. The sofa's cushions didn't go all the way down, so his feet were visible underneath it. The wide-eyed hobgoblin peeked out from his hiding spot as the stairway door opened. An older-looking human woman in a long plain dress and shirt stepped out with a pile of clothes in her hands. As Black Nail watched, she crossed the floor and reached the other door. Then, she pulled a key out from her pocket and there was a click as she unlocked the door. She pushed through and disappeared inside, but she left the door open behind her. Black Nail smirked excitedly as he rose from his hiding spot and crept over to the now open door. He looked through to make sure the woman was out of sight, and then slipped through as well. Problem solved. The room on the other side was pretty much the same as the last one. There was a lot of furniture and paintings. He didn't have a lot of time to look around though, as he soon heard the woman coming back. He hurried into a small dark side room as she passed, and then he heard the door to the stairway shut behind her and the click of it being locked. It seemed like he wouldn't be leaving the same way he'd come in. Black Nail didn't hear or smell anyone nearby, so he began to carefully explore the suite. He found a few trinkets and shinies someone had forgotten, so he picked them up so they wouldn't get lost. There were several more rooms as well, including a bedroom, but they didn't contain anything that was interesting or edible. They were also all empty. Fang wasn't here. That was a problem. This was supposed to be his lair, but that didn't mean he was always here. Obviously, he left it sometimes. Black Nail sighed. He really should have thought of that earlier. Oh, well, there was no other option but to wait for the man to come back. What was he going to do in the meantime though? He should probably find somewhere to hide. There weren't a lot of comfortable places he could hide for a long period of time, so after a brief search Black Nail chose to conceal himself under the bed. The sheets that fell over the sides of the frame would conceal him, and as a bonus he could lay down on the floor. It was actually quite comfy. However, after a few minutes Black Nail began to grow bored. How long was this going to take? He gave a quiet yawn as he shifted around to get more comfortable. The entire bed had been placed over a rug so the floor wasn't too hard. Black Nail closed his eyes as he let out a deep breath and relaxed. He probably shouldn't let himself fall asleep. Black Nail was awakened by the sound of a door being slammed shut. As he blinked the sleep from his eyes he heard a pair of loud voices. Make sure I know the instant Zelena's message arrives. When we move to take Herad out I plan on being right out front. That crazy hag has been a pain in my side for too long. How arrogant do you have to be to just move south and claim the best territory around as your own exclusive little playground, the first deeper voice said. You'd have to have an ogre-sized ego to think it would work, boss. That's for sure, the other man replied. Well, the black snake is about to be cut down to size. Zelena's bought the cooperation, or at least the approval, of practically every chief in town. Only that pompous fool the governor objects, and he's just worried about not being able to play us off against each other anymore, the voice that Black Nail was sure belonged to Fang said. The hobgoblin ground his teeth as he listened. How dare they insult the chief of his tribe? So what if Herad was ugly? All humans were, they were pink. What a stupid color for skin to be. Green was so much better. Black Nail also knew Herad wasn't crazy, she was one of the sanest people he had ever met. It was the rest of the humans who were weird. Very true, boss. There's no way she can stand against you and your allies, the other man answered. She'll be outnumbered 5 to 1, and she's the only vessel in her pathetic little band. Including me and that assassin of Zelena's will have at least 5. Herad will be dead by the end of the week, and then all that nice territory she's claimed will be mine. Fang exclaimed excitedly. As well as whatever treasures she's hoarded away at her base, his subordinate added. Under the bed Black Nail went rigid with surprise. Fang was a slosher. That complicated things. True, although I don't imagine it's any great prize. That's enough of this useless talk. Go downstairs and send one of the winches up, make it the new blonde. I'm feeling like a good romp, Fang told the other man. Yes sir, sure thing, the man said before heading back down the stairs. Black Nail's target was now alone on the 3rd floor. The hobgoblin under the bed grinned with eager anticipation as he plotted the man's murder. This was going perfectly, and would be so much fun. Since Fang was a slosher, the safest plan was probably to just wait until he fell asleep and then to slit his throat. That would involve a lot of waiting though, and Black Nail had already had a nice long nap. He really didn't want to fight a slosher though. If he was anywhere near as dangerous as Herad, then he would be very unlikely to win. So, Black Nail waited and listened as the man named Fang wandered around the apartment. After a few minutes he walked over to the bed and sat down. His feet dangled and swayed right in front of Black Nail's face. Then, a shirt hit the floor as the man started getting undressed. The shirt was soon followed by a pair of pants. As the trousers landed there was a whirring noise and several golden coins rolled out. Black Nail's eyes watched them intently as they rolled. They were so shiny. He wanted to grab one, or more than one, but he knew it would be a dumb thing to do. Fang might be looking. As the hobgoblin watched, one of the coins rolled under the bed before falling over. Excitedly, Black Nail reached out and grabbed it. He smiled happily as he stared at its gleaming golden sides. Damn, bloody things, Fang suddenly swore. The bed then creaked as the man leaned over and began picking the coins up. Black Nail held his breath and started fervently hoping the man couldn't count. The hobgoblin had no such luck. After he was done picking up the other coins, Fang got off the bed and dropped to his knees. He then reached over and lifted the edge of the sheets up to look under the bed. The hobgoblin and the man stared at each other for a second. Neither of them said anything. Black Nail's hood wasn't up, so Fang got a good look at the hobgoblin's green, angular, and very inhuman face. Den of Beasts 5. Gods. What in all the hells, the man whispered as his eyes went wide with shock. Black Nail flashed the man a toothy smile, and then stabbed him in the face with his knife. Fang screamed as the blade sliced down his cheek. He clutched his face and tried to pull back away from the bed. Black Nail didn't let him. He grabbed the man's hair and pulled him down. Black Nail had forgotten Fang was a slosher though, and very strong. The entire bed flipped as the man pulled the hobgoblin out from under it and into the air. The violent motion wrenched Black Nail's arm, and he hissed in pain as his shoulder made an unpleasant grinding noise. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. The hobgoblin swung through the air, as Fang roared in pain. Black Nail tried to right himself using his feet, but just ended up kicking Fang in the face several times. The large man snarled viciously and tried to reach over and grab Black Nail's neck with one hand. The hobgoblin let him, and then he stabbed the man again. Stabbing things seemed to solve most of his problems. His knife gouged into Fang's shoulder and nicked his neck. The bandit chief roared in pain again and threw Black Nail across the room. Blood from Fang's wounds flew through the air, as the hobgoblin smashed into a wall and then slid to the floor. Ow, why did humans have to be so big and strong? Gods. What the fuck are you, a demon? Have the hells opened up for me? Fang cursed as he staggered and tried to stand straight. Blood poured from the cut on his neck. He was clutching it tightly with his hands, but that barely slowed the crimson flow. That was bad for him, but good for Black Nail. Black Nail didn't feel much better though. Every bone in his body hurt and the impact with the wall had knocked the air from him, explosively. The first rule of a challenge was not to show weakness though. Yes, I'm a demon. Tonight SS you die, Black Nail hissed dramatically in his scariest voice, which was actually just his normal voice. The hobgoblin pulled himself up off the ground. He was unsteady on his feet and wobbled a little, but he managed to start walking over to his target. Fuck you, the man cursed in reply. Fang was injured and in his underwear, but he was still a slosher. He looked around the room for something to use as a weapon. There was a vase on top of a nearby stand, so the man grabbed it and then threw it at his attacker. Black Nail slid out of the way of the porcelain projectile and continued to close the distance. Fang then picked up the wooden stand itself and hurled that. This time one of its legs nicked Black Nail's shoulder. He stumbled slightly and winced. There was no real damage though, beyond another bruise. Fang took this time though to reach down with his one free hand and grab his pants from off the floor. Black Nail grinned with savage amusement. What was he planning to do with those? His smile slipped though when the man managed to fumble through the trousers and pull out a small dagger. Black Nail would have been more concerned, but Fang's eyes were starting to look unfocused and he'd grown very pale. Still, it was better not to take any risks. Black Nail tucked his own knife away and drew his sword instead. Fang grimaced in anger and frustration as the hobgoblin approached. Black Nail raised his sword and then slashed down at the man. Fang raised an arm defensively and tried to block with his dagger, but Black Nail was too fast for him. The sword cut into the man's arm, and then Black Nail kicked him in the knee. There was a crunching noise as Fang collapsed onto his side. He shrieked in pain, and blood sprayed from his arm. The hobgoblin didn't give him time to recover. He mercilessly began hacking and slashing at the fallen man until Fang's struggling stopped, and he went limp. Black Nail only stopped when the gory mess at his feet was clearly a corpse. Then, he lined the blade up just right, and cut the man's head off. Then, he tried again because it didn't quite come off right the first time. When the head was completely severed, Black Nail gave it a brief shake to get some of the blood out, and then he wrapped it in a sheet from the bed. He was interrupted from his work by the rather loud sound of the door at the top of the stairs exploding inwards. Almost immediately, he then heard the sound of hurried footsteps. Horse reek, Black Nail swore, as he stuffed his grisly trophy into his backpack. The hobgoblin pulled his hood up and sheathed his sword. He knew he only had seconds before he would be mobbed by a horde of very large and very angry humans, so he dashed towards the nearest window. He had no idea what was outside of it, but it had to be better for his health than staying there would be. It had gotten dark out while Black Nail had been napping. The hobgoblin grabbed the window frame and used it to swing around. Luckily for him, the exterior wall had a ridge he could grab. He used that to pull himself out of sight of anyone inside, and then he began scrambling down the side of the building. Below him was one of the grimy alleys that lay beside the tavern. There didn't seem to be anyone there at the moment, but Black Nail could hear swearing and yelling from the room he had just left. He was willing to bet people would soon pour out of Fang's lair and flood the streets. The climb down wasn't easy or fast, even for the hobgoblin. He couldn't go straight down because parts of the wall were too smooth to grip. Instead, he had to carefully feel his way around and scramble sideways to find footholds as he descended feet first. He disliked how long this was taking. He didn't have a lot to spare. The first story of the building was smaller than the others and recessed, so Black Nail had to jump down. His injured shoulder flared with pain as he landed on the ground. The hobgoblin just grunted and began running away as fast as he could. He could hear humans all around him, several of which seemed dangerously close by, so he dashed into a nearby alley that sounded empty. Behind him all the windows of Fang's lair started glowing brightly one by one as his men woke up and tried to respond to the turmoil around them. Angry shouts and cries of alarm began to fill the air. As Black Nail desperately tried to flee through the now dark city streets, he hissed in pain. His pace slowed as his ankle began to hurt. He tried to fight past the pain, but his foot also felt weaker and unsteady when he put weight on it. He lurched sideways and limped into a small alley, as he heard a group of humans approach from ahead. The tight pathway was free of debris or clutter. This made traversing it easier, but it also meant there was nothing to hide behind, and that mattered. The sound of footsteps echoed behind Black Nail as a mob of humans hurried his way. There was no way the hobgoblin could outrun them, so he looked around for anything that would help him escape or hide. There was nothing on the ground, so he looked higher up. He hissed in annoyance as he noticed the large overhangs on the low roofs that bordered the alley. There was no way he could quickly get over them and onto the rooftops. The sound of pursuit grew closer, and as Black Nail began to panic, an idea suddenly occurred to him. He sprinted towards the nearest wall and then ran up it. His ankle flared with pain, but he disregarded it. He wanted to live. Using his momentum, he jumped up off the wall and grabbed the overhanging roof. Grunting with effort, Black Nail then pulled himself up under the roof and against the wall. There were wooden supports along the wall he could hold onto. He hung there as a dozen thugs suddenly burst into the alley. They had torches that burned the shadows that encircled them away. Together the mob of humans hurried down the alley. Since the path was straight and empty, they didn't seem to be looking around too much. The light from the torches didn't reach into the dark recesses of the overhanging roof. Black Nail was tucked away in those shadows as he watched the men pass him by. If anyone looked his way, they would have seen his eyes reflecting the light. No one looked though. He let out a deep breath of relief as they turned the corner and disappeared out of sight. That had been close. If humans weren't so blind and stupid, he might have been caught there. There was no way a hobgoblin, or any animal really, would have missed the smell of blood in the air. He didn't hear anyone else close by, so Black Nail let himself drop back down to the ground. He then hurried back onto the street and away. Several times he was almost caught by groups of searching thugs, but he always managed to slip away at the last minute. There didn't seem to be any pattern or cooperation among the human search parties. They all appeared to be running around randomly. Eventually Black Nail got far enough away that he left the search parties behind, and the city grew quiet. Once free of pursuit, he slowed down, and began hobbling through the dark city towards Herod's residence. He would be safe when he got there, and could lie down for a while. He definitely wasn't going after the other bandit chief anytime soon. This hadn't been an experience he wanted to repeat. If only that ugly human bastard hadn't dropped those coins. It seemed unfair that Black Nail's perfect plan could be ruined by something so random. Herod would just have to be happy knowing Fang was dead, and having his bloody head as proof. 2 heads probably wouldn't fit in his bag anyway. The hobgoblin trudged through the dark and empty city streets for several minutes before he got to his destination. As he approached the front of Herod's lair, Black Nail saw 2 men standing guard outside. Light shone out from a window beside them and illuminated the lair's yard. The bored-looking lookout glanced his way as the cloaked hobgoblin drew nearer. Black Nail caught a whiff of their scent and was very relieved that one of them smelled familiar. He was far too exhausted to try and sneak in right now. "Halt, who goes there?" the first man asked as he placed a hand on the sword at his side. "Me," Black Nail replied unhelpfully. He was too tired to say more, not to mention he was feeling rather cranky. "Who?" the man asked suspiciously. "I'm Black Nail," was his only response. "What the hell's the hobgoblin? I'll believe that when the gods reveal it." "Ha, there's no way a hobgoblin could be wandering around the city," the first man replied. "I can if I want to," the hobgoblin replied, as he pulled his hood down and glared at the man. His eyes shone with barely suppressed anger and frustration. Both men took a surprised step away from him. The second man went pale as the moon, and then threw his partner a questioning look. After Black Nail was finished talking to Harad, he was going to smack these idiots. He began walking past the guards and up to the door of the building. "Hey, you can't just go in there," the man told him. "I can if I want to. I'm here to see Mistress Harad. Get in my way and I'll gut you like a rabbit," the hobgoblin hissed as he marched past the guards. They didn't try to stop him, they just stood aside and watched without moving. The dried splatter of blood all across his face might have had something to do it. The unfamiliar smelling one turned to the other. "That's not a real hobgoblin, is it?" "I mean, I heard some of the other guys talking, but I thought they were joking," he said nervously. His partner frowned and gave him a condescending look. He clearly didn't think much of the question. "He was green, you idiot." "Of course he's a hobgoblin, no human has ever had chompers like those, that's for damn sure," the other man replied. Black Nail flipped his hood back up and made his way inside. The room there was plain and several people were sitting at a table while playing cards. Their reactions to Black Nail's sudden presence varied, but every one of them looked surprised. None of them were Cedar or Harad, so the hobgoblin kept moving. Behind him several men pushed their chairs back and got to their feet, as an anxious-sounding conversation broke out. Black Nail could hear Harad's voice from deeper within the building. He followed it through the bare corridors. As he walked, everyone he saw moved out of his way without a word. Moments later he stood outside a closed door. One of Harad's personal guards stood beside it. The sound of conversation between the bandit chief and several of her minions could clearly be heard from within by the hobgoblin. "It's suicide to try and fight them all. My men and I joined your band because it sounded like you had a sweet setup down south. We didn't agree to fight all of Dagger Point for you," a deep-voiced man said. "You swore to follow me, so you don't have a choice," Harad replied with frosty calm. Harad still sounded more than a little angry, but Black Nail was too tired and sore to care. He was also willing to bet his present would cheer her up. "Open the door," the hobgoblin hissed to the guard. The man flinched as Black Nail's voice issued forth from under his hood. He looked startled for a second, but then relaxed as a look of comprehension came over his face. "Cedar's hobgoblin? What the hells are you doing here?" he asked. Black Nail sighed in frustration. Why were most humans all so stupid? His reason for being here was really obvious. "Open the door, SS. I'm here to see Harad," he told the man. "She doesn't want to be disturbed." "She told me not to open the door for anything short of an attack," the guard replied. "I understand, SS. I could stab you a few times if you want, SS, Black Nail offered helpfully. "Ha, no thanks. You don't scare me, you runt, I'll let you in though. If you piss the boss off it will be on your head, not mine," he replied with a confident smile, as he stepped aside. The hobgoblin gave him an annoyed look, but said nothing as he moved forward and politely knocked on the door. The argument going on inside subsided. "Come in," Harad called out from within. Black Nail took a second to remove the severed head from his backpack. It was still wrapped up but the cloth was now completely soaked through with blood. The man standing beside Black Nail stared in revulsion at the object in the hobgoblin's hands. The door swung open as Black Nail pushed it open and stepped through it. The spacious room on the other side had only one small window, and was thus mostly illuminated by a black iron chandelier that held a dozen bright white candles. A large square wooden table stood beneath the chandelier in the center of the room. The light from the candles revealed several people sitting around the table, but left the rest of the room in shadow. Harad, of course, was seated at the far end of the table in the largest chair. Cedar was sitting to her right. Black Nail threw them both confident looks as he walked in. Muted whispering broke out as the people around the table took in his cloaked form. Cedar, of course, recognized him immediately and frowned in concern. Harad raised an eyebrow in surprise as she gazed at him and noticed the bloody object in his hand. "You're dripping on my floor, Black Nail," she told him with apparent calm. "Sorry, mistress," he replied as he walked past the table and approached her. Black Nail wasn't fooled by her voice. He knew she was angry at him, and getting angrier. A subtle clue was how she was stroking her sword hilt. He had best get right to the point. As the hobgoblin came to a halt in front of her, Harad leaned forward and addressed him. "What are you doing here? I don't remember giving you permission to do that, hobgoblin. I also seriously doubt that Red Dog sent you, that wouldn't be much like him," she whispered as she glared at Black Nail with her icy blue eyes. "I wanted to serve, mistress. I heard there was something you wanted, so I went to get it for you." "It's a present," Black Nail quickly explained. The corner of Harad's mouth twitched as the hobgoblin finished speaking. She turned and looked at the bloody object that dangled from his hand. "That's your present? This had better be good, hobgoblin. Otherwise, you'll regret coming here," briefly, Harad told him. Black Nail hurriedly pulled the cloth off, and held up the severed head within by its hair. There were gasps around the table as everyone took in the sight. Fang's face was splattered with blood and loose strands of hair were stuck to it. His skin had gone corpse white, and his jaw hung loosely so his mouth gaped open. Most disturbingly, his dead eyes stared forward unblinkingly. The hobgoblin's mistress looked at it with disgust. Black Nail realized he had better explain. She probably didn't recognize him. "For you, mistress. I give you the head of the man named Fang," he hissed dramatically. Den of Beast 6. The entire room went silent. Harad's mouth went slightly slack and her eyes widened the tiniest bit. She stared in surprise at the severed head for several seconds. Black Nail really hoped it was a good type of surprise. The suspense was actually painful. By all that is holy and all that is profane, it is him, she whispered. Nope, that didn't help. The hobgoblin still couldn't tell if Harad was pleased or not. Maybe she just needed a reminder of why she had wanted Fang dead in the first place. I killed him, he was fat, and you didn't like him, Black Nail clarified hopefully. As the anxious hobgoblin watched, a savage grin suddenly sprung into existence on Harad's lips. Her eyes began to gleam with excitement. Black Nail let out a breath of relief. He couldn't keep a happy smile from appearing on his lips, and he felt like dancing with joy. The chief was pleased by his gift. Truly, he was a genius. His plan was working perfectly. Why don't any of you bring me gifts like this? Harad said with a laugh and an amused glance towards Cedar and the others around the table. From under his hood the happy hobgoblin grinned smugly at all the seated people. He was the chief's favorite. Black Nail threw the cloth onto the table and then put his trophy down on top of it. He'd carried the thing far enough already, and it was Harad's now anyway. He hoped she was going to put it somewhere it would look nice. In the light of the chandelier hanging overhead, Black Nail could clearly see the other people around the table throwing disbelieving looks at him and the severed head. A few of them had even gone pale, and one looked like he was about to be sick. They began chatting and whispering amongst themselves again, and the sound of their hushed voices echoed around the dark corners of the room. Cedar stood up to address his boss. I should go have a talk with Black Nail, and get a report from him somewhere more private, he told her. A thoughtful look appeared on Harad's face, and she glanced at the other men at the table. She then took another look at Black Nail and nodded. Agreed, take him to see Mahedium. He looks more than a little worse for wear, she told Cedar quietly. As you wish, he replied emotionlessly. Cedar then grabbed the hobgoblin's shoulder and began dragging him from the room. Black Nail was surprised at his master's sudden action. He wanted to stay and gloat some more. Everyone had been so surprised when he'd unwrapped Harad's gift. No one was going to look down on him now, and he wanted to make sure all the new recruits at the table knew his new status. The sound of Harad's raised voice could be heard from behind them as she resumed her previous conversation with the other people at the table. The voices were quieter though, and unlike when he'd first entered, Harad now seemed to have control of the conversation. Once they were out of the room and down the hallway where there was no one else around, Cedar turned to Black Nail. The hobgoblin grinned at his master proudly, but Cedar scowled back at him. Fool, the old scout said as he smacked the hobgoblin across the side of the head. Ow! Black Nail exclaimed in surprise, before rubbing the sore spot and cringing. What do you think you're doing? Look at you, you're half dead. If you were just going to wander around and pick fights then you should have stayed at the camp, Cedar told him. I won. Black Nail whined. This time. What about the next time though? I have no idea how, or why, you pulled this stupid trick off. You wouldn't have if you'd stopped to think for a second though. Now that you've acted as Harad's personal assassin once, she's going to expect you to do it again. Cedar told Black Nail angrily. Oh, that's not ss good, Black Nail remarked hesitantly as he thought it through. Of course it's not. I hope you had fun getting the crap kicked out of you, because Dagger Point is stuffed full of killers and sloshers who hate Harad. So congratulations, you've just volunteered to fight every single one of them, Cedar explained scornfully. The hobgoblin licked his lips nervously. This sounded like it was going to be a serious problem. He'd definitely not enjoyed fighting the man named Fang. Well, actually he'd had lots of fun sneaking around and cutting Fang up, but that didn't make up for beating the bandit chief had given him. He still hurt in places he hadn't even known existed before. I'm too injured. Black Nail tentatively offered as an excuse. Ha, as if she'll care. Harad has her own problems to deal with, and now she has a solution in you. How much do you think she'll care about your injuries? Cedar responded. Not ss at all, the hobgoblin said with a sigh. Exactly, you idiot. Let's hope we can get you patched up quickly, although judging by the way you're limping I doubt that will happen. Here, lean on me, you shouldn't be putting weight on that ankle, his master told Black Nail. I'm fine ss, I can walk, Black Nail replied with a stubborn tone. Don't make me smack you again, boy, Cedar threatened as he raised a hand. Black Nail winced and hissed in annoyance, but when his master extended an arm he took it. As they continued walking down the hallway, Black Nail leaned on Cedar's shoulder. Soon, they arrived outside a heavy wooden door. Without bothering to knock, Cedar pushed the door open and strode inside. Immediately, after entering, the hobgoblin knew he was in Mahedium's new workshop. Everything about this room strongly reminded Black Nail of the mage's room back at the camp. Glass beakers of colorful liquids were scattered around an otherwise sparse chamber. More than a few crystals could be seen as well. They were either floating in some of the glasses or placed on shelves beside piles of books and delicate-looking pieces of equipment. Mahedium was seated at a desk across the room and scribbling something on some papers. He looked up at them as they entered the chamber. A scowl appeared on his face when he saw Cedar, but it disappeared when he saw Black Nail. His eyes shone with interest as he looked the hobgoblin over. Black Nail? I didn't know you'd joined us, he remarked cheerfully. I got an injured hobgoblin here, mage. You think you can patch him up? He looks like someone thrashed him until he was black and blue, and green, Cedar asked the mage. Mahedium got up from the desk and met them in the center of the room. He didn't even look at Cedar, and instead focused completely on Black Nail. I'll have to examine him first, and then hope hobgoblins react to drugs in a similar way to humans, the mage answered. You don't have healing magic? Cedar asked. No, I don't, for a lot of reasons. The Fiery Eye is not a guild that worries about healing too much, and even if they were, there's no way I would have gotten my hands on any healing spells. Healers are highly trained specialists, and they're treated much better than combat mages, Mahedium replied with a frown, as he leaned over and examined Black Nail's bruised neck. I should have figured, Cedar responded grumpily. Let's get him into the light where I can get a better look at him. Over there on that chair should serve our purpose, Mahedium remarked. Cedar guided Black Nail towards the seat Medium had indicated and then placed him gently down, while Mahedium wandered the room and gathered a few things from the shelves. A few minutes later the mage returned and stared thoughtfully at Black Nail. He then touched a crystal on a nearby desk and it flared to life. This new light made it much easier to see. How do you feel, Black Nail? You definitely looked unsteady earlier. Are you suffering from nausea or a headache as well? He asked the hobgoblin. My head hurts, but what's nausea? Black Nail replied in confusion. Does your stomach hurt? The mage clarified. My everything hurts, the hobgoblin whined in response. Fine, but does it feel like you are going to vomit? Mahedium asked him. Why couldn't the man have just asked that in the first place? All these annoying questions were making Black Nail think, and thinking was making his head ache worse. No, I'm hungry though, Black Nail remarked hopefully. You're always hungry. Sometimes I think you're half pig, Cedar told the hobgoblin with a smile. That's probably a good sign, an appetite is a sign of health, Mahedium mused aloud before turning to Cedar. Please hold his left, and then right, eye open for me while I check something, he asked the scout in a businesslike manner, as he reached into one of his pockets and withdrew something. Black Nail tried to squirm away as his master grabbed his head and then proceeded to pry his one eye open. He was still feeling weak though, so even raising his arms took an effort. Ouch, what the hells were they trying to do to him? Hold still you silly runt, that's an order, Cedar barked as he tried to keep his hold on the hobgoblin. Reluctantly, Black Nail relaxed and stopped struggling. It hadn't really been doing him much good anyway. Cedar was also unusually strong right now for some reason. He must have been eating well recently. Mahedium reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny crystal that was barely bigger than his fingertip, and held it up to Black Nail's face. The hobgoblin tried to blink, but couldn't because Cedar was still holding his eyelid up. I thought you weren't going to use magic, Cedar remarked suspiciously. This is just a light crystal, the mage replied. As Black Nail stared at the mana stone it suddenly burst to life. He instinctively tried to flinch away, but Cedar was still gripping him tightly. He relaxed a second later when he realized the light wasn't really all that bright and didn't actually hurt his eyes. In fact the crystal was more than a little interesting to look at. He had never stared right at one while it was lit before. There was a tiny speck in the very middle that seemed brighter than the other parts. His reaction seems fine as well, so I don't think he's suffered a dangerous head injury, Mahedium observed as he pocketed the crystal again. After seeing that the mage was finished Cedar let go of Black Nail. The hobgoblin shook himself, and started blinking frantically to moisten his dry eyes. Meanwhile, the mage stood up and frowned down at Black Nail with concern. What's the matter now? Cedar grumbled impatiently. He's a hobgoblin, Mahedium answered as he looked off to the side with a distracted manner. I noticed that, since a while back actually, the old scout replied scornfully. Yes, most people would. He also has obvious external injuries, but trying to figure out which herbs to apply is an interesting challenge. He might not react the same way a human would, so I've chosen one of my more innoxious mixtures, the mage explained carefully. So apply it. Standing around and scowling isn't going to change anything, Cedar replied. Mahedium gave the older man an irritated look, but then got to work. Together, he and Cedar stripped Black Nail of most of his clothes. They then examined his wounds. The hobgoblin had only a few shallow cuts, but several rather impressive purple bruises decorated his skin. Hey, some of these are obviously at least a few days old, Mahedium remarked. The mage then began applying a sweet-smelling paste to Black Nail's wounds which numbed and cooled his skin. It was rather nice feeling, and soon the tension leaked from his body as he leaned back into the chair. What's in that stuff? It doesn't smell like anything I would use, Cedar remarked. It's white duff, cleggervane, and ground scalewood bark, Mahedium responded. Why are you using that crap? None of that has any real strength to it, Cedar asked him. I've been a master apothecary for almost a decade. I think I know which compounds to use, the mage replied, as he scowled with indignation. Apparently not, because I might not have a fancy title, but I've been treating wounds since before you were born. So I know, Cedar countered as the two men fell into an argument. The argument went on for several minutes, and both of them grew louder and more belligerent as time went on. It continued even after they had finished bandaging his wounds. Black Nail wasn't paying attention though. Despite the increasing noise levels, he was starting to fall asleep. Black Nail was still drifting back and forth across the black borders of consciousness when the argument ended. Thus, he didn't even notice when Mahedium collected a small sample of his blood from one of his wounds. Cedar noticed though and quickly turned towards the mage with an angry expression on his face. What do you think you're doing with that? What possible use could you have for his blood? He loudly demanded of the mage. The harsh sound of his voice woke Black Nail. The hobgoblin opened his eyes to see his master and Mahedium glaring hostilely at each other. So, nothing much had changed. I simply want to run some tests on it. Hopefully, I can use it to discover whether goblin blood will react differently than human blood to several chemicals. That way I can be reasonably sure they'll be safe to use on Black Nail. Why do you care? Mahedium answered confrontationally. Even a complete fool knows better than to let a mage take their blood. You could use it to place him under your power, Cedar responded. Then you definitely know as much as a complete fool. Even if those peasant superstitions are true, and I have no idea if they are, then do you really think that's that sort of thing the guilds would teach combat mages? No, of course it isn't. So why don't you just be quiet and let me work, Mahedium said as he glared at the old scout. Cedar opened his mouth as if to respond, but then stopped and seemed to think better of it. He appeared to think something over for a second before he next spoke. Fine, do as you will. I'm watching you though, Cedar warned him. Mahedium just snorted dismissively and walked away to the other side of the room. Once there he started going through his equipment and picking stuff out. Cedar turned back to Black Nail. How are you feeling? His master asked as he waved his hand in front of the hobgoblin's face. Sleepy. I want SS to nap, Black Nail replied before yawning. As he drowsily watched Cedar's hand move in front of his face, he felt a strange urge to snap at it. It kind of looked like a bird or something. He didn't actually try and bite it though, that would have involved getting up out of the chair. You can stay awake for a few minutes, you lazy runt. I have some questions that need answering. It's important, Cedar told him. Black Nail failed to respond and his eyes lipped shut again. Cedar got his attention with a smack to the side of his head. The hobgoblin sprang awake as a new source of pain flared into existence above his ear. Ow. I'm injured, Black Nail whined. You're too tough for your own good, so you'll survive. Now are you going to answer my questions, or do you need another smack? Cedar said. I'll answer, Black Nail replied as he rubbed the side of his head. Good, so I'm guessing you slipped away from camp and followed us here. What took you so long though? Cedar asked him. The hobgoblin considered the question for a second. It was a long story. Where to even start, and how could he tell it so that it would make him look the best? An impatient look appeared on Cedar's face. I got attacked by a hobgoblin, and had to rest, he blurted out, as Cedar raised a hand to hit him again. Explain, Cedar said as his eyes narrowed with interest. I was following SSU when you went past the bushy place. A nasty huge hobgoblin with impressive horns then jumped out and attacked me. He had lots and lots SS of goblins with him, and they all tried to kill me. I kicked and bit them all though, and managed to fight them off by myself. I then killed the hobgoblin, and became the new chief. Since I was injured by the cheating no-good hobgoblin's lucky hit, I decided to stay there a while and rest, Black Nail explained. Sounds like quite the adventure, if any of it's true. How did you get to the city? The old scout asked doubtfully. His master didn't seem to believe that Black Nail was telling the truth for some reason. It was kind of insulting. He was just leaving some stuff out, and maybe exaggerating a little. I asked for directions, twice, Black Nail replied as he shrugged. It hadn't been a big deal or anything. What? How? Never mind, I'll probably sleep better at night if I don't know the details, Cedar remarked. How did you end up killing Fang though? He was a blowhard, but still a slosher. How did you even know he was Herad's enemy or where to find him? I listened to Herad yell at some people, she was very loud, Black Nail explained. Ha, yes she is at that. It probably wasn't all that hard to find us since all you had to do was follow the sound of her constant screaming, Cedar said with a chuckle. Black Nail's eyelids were heavy and he didn't feel up to correcting Cedar, so he gave his master a brief nod. He also didn't want any part of insulting Herad. It was probably a good idea to change the topic of their conversation. I found Fang by playing a guessing game with a weird naked lady, Black Nail then told Cedar. There was silence. The smile on Cedar's face grew strained and his one eye twitched. Across the room Mahedium broke out into a fit of coughing. Had he said something wrong? You didn't murder this woman, did you? Cedar asked apprehensively. Nope, we just traded answers to questions. Do you usually kill people during guessing games? Black Nail asked with interest. No, I don't usually play them. Just in general it's a bad idea to kill people, okay? Cedar replied. Why? You do it all the time, and so does Herad, the hobgoblin pointed out. There was another amused snort from Mahedium. Cedar closed his eyes and messaged his forehead with his fingertips. Black Nail thought he looked a little upset. Ugh, I just realized Red Dog may have had a point after all. This is my fault as much as yours, though. I should have taught you about morals and civilized behavior. I guess I just never expected you to leave the woods, Cedar remarked. The round things you put stuff in? Black Nail asked in confusion. No, those are barrels. Morals are very different, Cedar explained with a sigh. The sound of steps echoed from the doorway so Black Nail twisted around to see who was approaching. The doorway was soon darkened by the red-headed form of Kita. The hobgoblin groaned when he saw her. Why did it have to be her? She was incredibly annoying, and he was stuck in this chair so he couldn't even escape. He already regretted saving her. Black Nail, I heard that you'd shown up. Everyone was talking about the small creepy cloaked guy who killed that bastard Fang, and then presented his bloody head to Herad. How sharp is that? When they mentioned that the assassin had disappeared with Cedar I knew for sure it must have been you, she exclaimed happily with a cheerful grin on her face. Black Nail is injured so don't get too close and you can't stay long, Cedar told the young woman. The hobgoblin threw his master a grateful look, and Cedar gave him a knowing smile. Mahedium also responded from across the room. Oh, quite right. Keep at least a few feet away please, and no touching the patient, the mage told Kita distractedly. He seemed engrossed in studying something at his desk. Sure thing, I got stuff to do anyway. I'm super useful, so Herad keeps me pretty busy, Kida responded with undaunted cheer. You deliver messages, Cedar replied dryly. That's important. What if someone tried to steal the message? I would have to fight them off. In fact, I got into a fight earlier today, so ha. Kida told him as she stabbed the air with a make-believe knife. That had nothing to do with a message, they attacked you because. You know what? Never mind, Cedar said with obvious frustration. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you that you killing Fang was the sharpest thing I've ever heard of by far. I mean, come on, you brought his bleeding head to Herad in the middle of a meeting. How awesome is that, she told the hobgoblin. Does she know what morals are? Black Nail asked curiously while glancing at the still smiling Kida. I seriously doubt it, Cedar responded as he grimaced. Who does then? Black Nail inquired. Cedar sighed and rubbed his forehead again. He suddenly seemed more than a little tired, and his forehead had become creased by wrinkles. You know what? Forget I said anything. Just try to kill as few people as possible, okay? Cedar told him dryly. Advice to live by, unless you're an assassin of course, Kida interjected. Sure, Black Nail replied happily. He never killed anyone he didn't have to anyway. Why would he? That would be a lot of work, and more than a little silly. Den of Beasts 7. All of a sudden there was a gasp of surprise from where Mahedium was working, and then the mage began madly scribbling away and sorting through a pile of papers. Everyone looked over his way at the unexpected noise. Ha, I can't believe my luck, Mahedium exclaimed as he worked. Made a discovery, have you? Perhaps High Wart Plant is a goblin love potion or something? Cedar asked with a roll of his eyes. The mage didn't bother answering, or even appear to hear the other man. He just started chuckling to himself, as he stared at Black Nail's blood sample. Cedar scowled and looked worried. I think our mage has lost it, Cedar remarked. Even Black Nail found the mage's behavior more than a little odd. The hobgoblin got excited over blood sometimes, but only when it was fresher, and there was a lot more of it. He needs to stop sniffing his own herbs, if you know what I mean, Kida said. Black Nail had no idea what she meant. Cedar apparently did though, because the corner of his mouth curled up into something that sort of resembled a grin. Mahedium ignored Kida and turned to Cedar. I've made an incredibly exciting find. It has nothing to do with herbs though. After the surprise revelation that Varha's pet goblin had the mage spark, I decided to run some tests on Black Nail's blood just in case, and I just found something, he announced with obvious excitement. The young mage was practically vibrating with enthusiasm. In one hand he held up a small vial of purple liquid. Oh, is goblin blood like deadly poison or secretly magical? Kida remarked. No, that's idiotic. Stay silent while the grown-ups are talking, please, Mahedium replied irritably. What did you find? Cedar asked curiously, as Kida glared at Mahedium. Before I say anything I want to be absolutely sure I'm right, so I need to perform a few more quick tests, the mage answered as he quickly gathered up several things from his desk. Once Mahedium had what he wanted he hurried over to where Black Nail was sitting. The hobgoblin eyed him warily. He was fairly sure he didn't want the mage running any more tests, or performing any weird magic, on him. The eye test from earlier had been uncomfortable enough. Open your mouth, please. Normally I'd just take a hair sample. Since you don't have much in the way of hair though, I'm going to have to take a look at your teeth, Mahedium told Black Nail. The mage raised his hands in front of Black Nail's face and waited expectantly. The hobgoblin met the mage's gaze and gave him a dubious stare. The man couldn't seriously be planning on shoving his hands in between his jaws, could he? I don't want your fatty human hands in my mouth. They'll taste bad, Black Nail replied as he stuck out his tongue in disgust. I keep my hands very clean, and I just washed them, Mahedium responded. You're still human, and oily, the hobgoblin muttered. Just get it over with, Black Nail. I'll get you a treat right after, Cedar told him impatiently. The hobgoblin sighed but did as he was told. Maybe he could convince his master to get him one of those meat pies from earlier. Mahedium raised his tiny light crystal up to Black Nail's mouth. As it flared to life he raised a small knife and began to carefully poke and prod around the hobgoblin's teeth. It was more than a little annoying, and Black Nail gave Mahedium an irritated look. As he had suspected, the man's fingers also tasted horrible, like old sweat. Hey, I expected them to be dirtier. You actually keep your teeth fairly clean, the mage commented as he worked. Black Nail's eyes narrowed. Why wouldn't his mouth be clean? It was humans that were weird and smelly. I know it's tempting, but don't bite him, Cedar told Black Nail. A few seconds later the mage withdrew his hand and smiled proudly to himself. Black Nail shut his mouth and rubbed his jaw. Holding it open like that had been kind of painful. I was right. An elemental test of his blood revealed traces of crystal integration, and just now I discovered his teeth show subtle signs of fairly recent crystallization, Mahedium announced. So he's a mage too? Cedar replied warily. He didn't seem too happy at the idea, which kind of hurt Black Nail's feeling. Hadn't he earned his master's trust yet? The hobgoblin wouldn't mind becoming a mage. There were so many things he wanted to blow up. It would be glorious. No, that's not indicative of the evidence I found. If he was a mage he wouldn't show the secondary signs such as crystallization of the teeth. Not to mention, I tested him for that not too long ago and found nothing. He's also not a mutant, for obvious reasons. So, by process of elimination we can conclude that Black Nail is actually a dormant vessel, Mahedium explained happily. Hey, that's what I just said, his blood's magical, Kida muttered as she glared angrily at the mage. No one bothered to respond to her. Black Nail sighed in disappointment. So he wasn't a mage, and he wouldn't get to start blowing things up with magic. At least he was a vessel thingy though. That made him super strong or something, right? How's that possible? He's never shown any signs of that, and he's certainly never taken any elixir, Cedar asked with a voice full of doubt as he crossed his arms in front of himself. I don't know how he was initially exposed to some form of elixir, but at some point he undoubtedly was. As to him not showing any signs of being a vessel, well, the answer to that is obvious. He hasn't had any elixir to fuel himself, so the ability is now completely dormant, the mage replied. So it's utterly useless, since we have no way of getting him elixir or even knowing what the right type is, Cedar pointed out with more than a little evident relief. Maybe. I'd like to run a few more tests, and there's someone in town that I may be able to consult with. It might be technically possible to find the correct type, Mahedium told them. Well, good luck with that. Just don't be expecting to draw too much more of Black Nail's blood. With the way things are going, he's going to need it right where it is. If you want to play around with a vessel's blood, feel free to ask Herad, though, Cedar told the mage. I have as of yet not decided on the proper time or method of asking Herad for a blood sample, Mahedium admitted reluctantly. And that's why you are still alive, Cedar told him. His remark caused Kida to chuckle, which earned her a glare from Mahedium. Black Nail wasn't quite sure what was going on, so he decided to ask. What does me being a vessel mean? He asked the others. Nothing really, don't worry about it, Cedar replied. It means if you find this one type of magic potion, then it will give you magical powers, and you won't die or explode or anything, Kida added. Good, that's good, Black Nail mused aloud. He really wanted magic of his own, and he definitely didn't want to explode. It sounded like he needed to find this elixir stuff. There's absolutely no way to find the right elixir though, Cedar told the hobgoblin. That's not completely true. I just finished telling you that I may know of someone who could help, Mahedium argued. Fine, you do what you want. If you manage to find anything, then tell us, but don't expect any help looking. Also, if you tell Herad about any of this nonsense, then I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. Thanks to Black Nail's recent idiocy, she already has enough weird notions in her head about using him. If you tell her about this, Cedar warned the mage. He stopped talking when Black Nail poked him urgently on the shoulder, and he threw the hobgoblin a confused glance. Black Nail's eyes were wide with concern. He hadn't noticed it at first because he'd been distracted by the conversation, but now he definitely heard the sound of familiar footsteps approaching. Ah, Cedar, you're so predictable sometimes. I knew you'd try to keep the hobgoblin away from me, Herad said as she walked through the doorway and into the room. I'm sorry if I'm intruding, but the things you were just saying sound so intriguing. I'm having weird notions, am I? We'll have to talk about that later. Right now though, I want my mage there to tell me more about the rather interesting conversation you were all just having. There was a rather nasty-looking grin on her face that was directed Cedar's way, and from under her dark bangs her eyes gleamed with furious excitement. Black Nail winced in apprehension and took a step away from Cedar. His master should have kept his big mouth shut. Fuck, Cedar grunted quietly, before turning around and facing his boss. Explain, now, Herad commanded Mahedium. Right, of course, the mage stuttered in reply. As you undoubtedly heard just now, after running some tests on Black Nail's blood, I discovered that some time ago he must have ingested a sample of elixir. Obviously, he managed to survive the transformation into a vessel, but he hasn't been showing any signs, the mage quickly explained before Herad cut him off with an annoyed glare and wave of her hand. I heard that part, and I don't much care. I don't need another vessel, I need access to elixir. Get to the part where you mentioned knowing someone that might be able to supply you with some, she told him with a disdainful sneer. Mahedium opened his mouth as if to talk, but then closed it again. His forehead grew creased and he seemed reluctant to speak. Herad made an irritated growling noise, and he flinched before finally answering. Since my arrival in Dagger Point, I've been making inquiries about any other rogue mages that might be in the city. Most of the leads I've found were dead ends, unfortunately. None of the mages in this city are very knowledgeable about the magic they flaunt. They're the lowest sort of combat mage, with not a scholar among them, Mahedium bitterly told her. As the mage talked, Cedar's eyes flickered towards the exit. He looked to be considering trying to slip away while Herad was distracted. Black Nail didn't blame him. Even the market for spellstones and elixirs is very limited and expensive. It contains nothing but the occasional piece of loot taken off a corpse. I highly suspect most of the crystals get purchased and then returned unused to the market when their owner is murdered, Mahedium continued. But you said you found someone, Herad pointed out impatiently. Yes, there was one merchant who seems to have a steady source of several elixirs, including Braxwell's and White Strom. He refused to even discuss where he got it at first, but I was persistent. Eventually, I managed to get him to deliver a message to his supplier. I only got a short reply back, but it was enough to confirm my suspicions that someone in town is creating the elixir. They've agreed to meet with me in order to facilitate an exchange of knowledge, the mage concluded. Tricky, Cedar remarked softly. Yet, more than worth a little risk. A reliable source of elixir could change the odds against us completely, Herad added with a hostile glare at Cedar. Black Nail blinked in surprise at Herad's reaction to Cedar. He was more than a little surprised she hadn't sheathed a few of her knives into his master's chest already. She seemed really focused on getting her hands on this elixir stuff. He almost thought he detected the tiniest bit of sour-smelling desperation from her. True, but that doesn't mean we should run right into this. Anyone with a monopoly on such a lucrative trade isn't going to just give it up, and is more than likely working with one of the other chiefs. It's probably a trap, Cedar replied as he frowned in concern. Obviously, it could be a trap. I don't need you to tell me that, Cedar. We'll just have to take precautions, and turn it back on them if they're stupid enough to try something, Harad told him scornfully. Black Nail smiled as he listened. He thought that sounded fun. The idea of the hunter becoming the hunted amused him. When and where's this meeting supposed to take place? Cedar asked Mahedium. 2 days from now at a residence in the central district of the city. I'm allowed to come armed and bring one companion, the mage answered. You agreed to enter a location of their choosing, with only one man for backup? I honestly thought you were smarter than that, Mahedium. This magic stuff is sure makes idiots out of people, Cedar told him. I'm not stupid, Cedar. They're allowing me to bring my gear, and I'm a combat mage. I'll have someone with me to watch my back, and enough magic at my disposal to level a small building. Besides, meeting in a public place wouldn't do me any good, I'll be visiting their lab. We'll need equipment and resources in order to accomplish anything, the mage replied. What if they take you by surprise? Cedar asked. I'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen. You're worrying too much anyway. I'll be going to the inner city, which is neutral territory. If they cause a disturbance there, it will draw the attention of the governor, Mahedium responded. Ha, I have way more experience with this city than you, boy. The governor and his men may enforce peace within the center of this snake pit, but they're powerless outside of it without the backing of the band leaders. They also don't care about murder, just that it doesn't happen on the streets, Black Nail's master countered scornfully. It's worth the risk, Cedar. You've said enough, don't you think? So shut your trap, Harad ordered the old scout before turning to the mage. Who were you planning on taking with you, Mahedium? Yesterday I couldn't have told you, but just now I decided on taking Black Nail, Mahedium replied. Absolutely not. Cedar barked immediately. Harad threw him a dark look and the old scout took a step back. Cedar looked like he really regretted speaking. It's very simply not up to you, so be quiet. Black Nail is no longer your servant, Harad told him coldly, before turning to Black Nail. It's up to Hobgoblin himself, and me. You're both my minions. Black Nail froze as everyone looked his way. Oh, this wasn't good. He really didn't like being in the middle of a fight between Harad and Cedar. No matter which side he chose, it wouldn't be good for him. Why couldn't everyone just get along? I had intended his presence to serve several purposes. You just mentioned that I should be concerned about being taken by surprise. I think we can agree that's unlikely to happen if Black Nail is with me. They will be unprepared for the superior senses of a hobgoblin, Mahedium reasoned. Cedar just scowled and grunted vaguely in response. Black Nail however grinned happily to himself. Mahedium was right, hobgoblins were both superior and more sensible than humans. If they have good intentions and we can come to a deal, then Black Nail will also serve as a test of their skill as well. If they can make an elixir for him, they can undoubtedly make one for Harad as well, Mahedium explained to Cedar. You could just take a blood sample with you, Cedar told him. I thought you didn't want me taking any more samples from Black Nail, Mahedium replied scornfully. Black Nail will go with Mahedium, and he'll even get a pay raise for volunteering. To reflect his increased usefulness, Harad said with a meaningful look at Black Nail. The hobgoblin gave her a confused look back, before realizing what she wanted a second later. Oh well, surely Cedar wouldn't blame him since Harad was giving him an order, sort of. He kind of wanted to go anyway. From what he had heard, this might be his best shot of getting some magic of his own. That would be so useful. I'll go with Mahedium SS. I'll fill these men with fear, and stab the people who try to hurt him, Black Nail told Harad with an enthusiastic nod of his head. Cedar scowled grumpily at the hobgoblin's reply, but he didn't say anything. Harad threw a smug grin his way. She seemed to take a lot of pleasure from gloating over Cedar. I'll go too. I'm also great at stabbing people, Kida added from where she was standing off to one side. You'll be staying here, safely out of the way, Harad told the younger woman without even looking at her. But, Kida started to say before Black Nail kicked her in the back of the knee. Kida stumbled and glared with narrowed eyes at the hobgoblin, but he didn't care. She seriously didn't know when to stop talking. You didn't argue with Harad, you shut up and did as she told you. It's settled then. Mahedium will take Black Nail, and together they'll enter this rogue mage's laboratory. I'll prepare a squad of men that will wait nearby. If there's trouble, then Mahedium will signal us using magic, Harad told everyone. Thank you for your support in this, Mistress Harad. I predict this endeavor will benefit us both greatly. As for a signal, I could always aim a force blast upwards. That should make a lot of noise and throw quite a bit of debris into the air. It would be hard to miss, the mage remarked. What could go wrong? Cedar muttered grouchily as he glanced at Harad's turned back. Den of Beasts 8. Black Nail and Mahedium were walking through the city alone. It was a cloudy afternoon in Dagger Point, as the pair made their way down one of the city's main streets. Several days had passed since the hobgoblin had rejoined Harad's band. He'd spent most that time lying around, healing, and stuffing his face with food. It was just afternoon and the roads were crowded. Crowds of bustling people were everywhere, so Black Nail wore his long dark brown cloak. With the hood up, it completely concealed his form, and prevented him from drawing unwanted attention. The two of them still got the occasional second glance though. They made for an odd-looking pair. Mahedium was dressed up to impress. He wore a set of fine clothes including a red shirt with long loose sleeves. He had also shaved and gotten a haircut, which made him look much different than the disheveled and distracted man he usually seemed to be. Most importantly, he wore several pouches around his waist, and was carrying his staff. Even though everyone on the street was armed, and half of them were thieves and killers, no one bothered them. A mage was more than the nearby thugs and pickpockets were willing to tangle with, and they didn't know what to make of Black Nail. The crowds grew thinner as they neared the central quarter of the city. The border was obvious in the daytime, but Black Nail had only been here at night before. Not only were the houses larger and better maintained there, but there were far less people on the street. Several men with helmets who were holding long spears and wearing steel breastplates watched everyone who passed. Their choice of equipment made them stand out. Spears and shiny metal weren't popular with most the other humans in the city, probably because they made it harder to run away. The metal-wearing humans didn't stop anyone from passing into the central quarter, but only a few people seemed to want to walk past them anyway. Black Nail noticed that the shiny men got a lot of hostile looks from other people on the street. Even though they were badly outnumbered by the nearby crowds, no one tried to start anything, though. Obviously, the spearmen weren't very popular, but they were respected warriors nonetheless. As they were walking, Mahedium turned to Black Nail, and pointed at the steel-clad humans. Those are the governor's men, and we're entering his territory. He allows anyone entry, but they have to obey his rules. Mostly, they involve keeping the streets orderly and clear. Stick by me, and don't draw attention to us, the mage told the hobgoblin. Black Nail gave the mage an annoyed glare. That had been his plan anyway. He had obviously been doing that the entire way here, so why did Mahedium feel the need to mention it? Humans, other than his master, must just really like to hear themselves talk. As they crossed the border, Mahedium started to look nervous. He was very obviously staring at the guards out of the corner of his eye, and he'd grown twitchy. Black Nail on the other hand just strolled casually by. He didn't see a reason to be nervous. There were already plenty of humans around, and these were just a few more. The mage and the hobgoblin made it past the governor's men unimpeded. The spearmen didn't try to stop them. As they headed deeper into the inner part of the city, the houses and buildings began to get larger and fancier. There were noticeably less people out and about as well. The humans here were better dressed, but the occasional group of thugs and miscreants still could be seen wandering around. The crowds were also quieter, and there was a lot less shouting. As Black Nail observed the surroundings, a patrol of half a dozen of the armored men from before came down the street. These ones had swords instead of spears, but they were obviously from the same tribe as the border guards. We should be near the right place. Keep a lookout for any signs that mention our destination, Mahedium told the hobgoblin as they walked. I can't do the reading thing, Black Nail pointed out. Ah, of course you can't. I should have realized that. You've obviously never had a chance to learn. Maybe I'll teach you the basics sometime, Mahedium replied as he looked around. Black Nail snorted. Why would he want to learn to read anyway? All his time was spent doing chores and learning useful things like cooking and sword fighting. There were so many things he had to practice already. Reading seemed useless to him anyway. He would be better off burning books for warmth, or clubbing people over the head with them. Ah, there it is, Mahedium exclaimed as he pointed to a building up ahead of them. It was a large mansion surrounded by a wrought iron fence. The inner section of the city was where all the larger and better maintained homes were located, which in Dagger Point just meant they were more than one story and weren't in immediate danger of falling down. This home, however, looked to be in good repair. There wasn't a single shingle missing from the roof. The only obvious flaw was that the grounds were overgrown, but the fact it had grounds at all was impressive. Most the other buildings just had a large patch of mud out front. The yard behind the iron fence had several large trees scattered across it. A long wild-looking row of hedges ran along the path, up from the gate to the front door of the residence. There were also a few overgrown flower beds full of weeds. All the unkempt greenery cast a lot of shadows in the afternoon sun, and gave the building a sinister air. Black Nail barely gave the house and yard a second glance though. His attention was focused on the large rough-looking man standing on the other side of the gate. He had a sword at his hip and a mean look in his eyes that reminded Black Nail of the more dangerous bandits from Herod's band. The man was without a doubt an experienced killer, and not one of the governor's men. The hobgoblin eyed him carefully as he and the mage approached, and he couldn't help but growl softly. The fact that such a human was being used as a guard made him more than a little uneasy. The owner of the house wasn't messing around when it came to security. The guard wasn't looking their way, but Black Nail wasn't fooled. He could tell by the man's posture and movements that he'd noticed the two of them approaching. The man was good, not great, but still good. Mahedium didn't seem to notice Black Nail's concern, because he walked right up to the man and announced himself. I'm Mahedium Loggart and I have an appointment with your master. As per the agreement, I have come armed and with one escort, the mage declared confidently. The guard gave Mahedium and Black Nail a brief look over. His stare was intense, but also indifferent at the same time. Black Nail had to stifle another growl. The man's condescending attitude raised his hackles. Without a word, the man then stepped over and unlocked the gate, before throwing it open. Enter, he told them emotionlessly. Mahedium hesitated and an uneasy look flashed across his face. He was clearly thrown a little off balance by the guard's attitude. After a few seconds though, he unfroze and walked through the gate. The hobgoblin shadowed him closely while keeping careful watch on the guard. He already didn't like this place. He certainly wasn't a cheery fellow. The master of this abode should really consider getting some friendlier staff. There's something to be said for basic courtesy after all, the mage muttered as he walked up the path to the house. Why would anyone want such inhuman thugs around? Black Nail met Mahediam's gaze. The mage blinked and stared at the hobgoblin for a second before sighing. Right, never mind, he then muttered to himself. The hedge loomed to their right as they approached the end of the path. When they got to the entrance, Mahediam knocked politely. It was a massive wooden double doors. Almost immediately they began to swing open. The mage looked nervously through the entranceway. Another guard similar to the first one stood on the other side, and had opened the doors. Please take a seat, he told them before stepping aside. The room on the other side was huge and dark. It was 2 stories tall and large enough to fit dozens of people. A pair of staircases ran up the walls on either side of the room, and led to the second floor. The windows were few in number however, and had curtains on them that blocked the light. As a result, the corners of the room were dim and shadowy. Mahediam threw Black Nail a nervous glance, but the hobgoblin just shrugged. The mage had been the one that had wanted to come here, and hobgoblins could see in the dark. With another sigh, Mahediam stepped into the house. A flair for the dramatic is pretty common in mages, but this seems like overkill, even to me, he muttered to himself. Plush red furniture lined the room, including several couches and chairs, so Mahediam headed for the nearest set and sat down. Black Nail sat down beside him, in a chair that was as comfy as it was ornate and red. Just as he was settling down, a casual breath brought an unexpected scent with it. The building smelled of human blood. Not just one person either, but many different humans. Black Nail was unsure of what to make of it, so he decided to ask. The hobgoblin casually leaned over towards his companion, and whispered in his ear. It smells of human SS blood here. Many different people SS, Black Nail told the mage. Mahediam looked rather uncomfortable and wary of having Black Nail so close, but after the hobgoblin finished speaking his eyes narrowed and he frowned uneasily. He appeared to be thinking something over. It's probably nothing, don't worry about it, the mage replied after a few seconds. Black Nail shrugged and sat back down in his chair. He could tell the mage wasn't being entirely forthcoming, and was somewhat concerned about something, but he didn't really care. It was probably just some pointless human thing anyway. After a few minutes of waiting for something to happen, Mahediam began to scowl impatiently, and Black Nail grew bored. The hobgoblin could only amuse himself by examining the contents of the room for so long. The guard by the door was particularly boring, as all he did was stare straight ahead. The hobgoblin was tempted to throw something at him, just to see what would happen. He doubted Mahediam would approve though. Black Nail shifted restlessly in his seat. At least the chair he was sitting in was very comfy. As he moved, the plush cushions made him spring up into the air slightly. He smiled at the unusual sensation, and did it again on purpose. Soon the bored hobgoblin was bouncing up and down on the chair and snickering to himself in amusement. The chair was just so soft and springy. He needed to find a chair like this to borrow when no one was using it, or around to see him. Black Nail's antics finally caused the man by the door to turn towards the visitors. He began scowling at the hobgoblin in annoyance, and with more than a little disbelief. Mahediam noticed as well. Stop that, it's impolite. Just sit still, he whispered to Black Nail. The hobgoblin sighed but did as he'd been told, it had been getting old anyway. Once Black Nail had settled down, they only had to wait a few more minutes for their host to arrive. A set of doors across the room were thrown open and 2 men stepped out. The first was an older man, even older than Cedar. He wore immaculate black clothing with silver lining, was bald, and sported a neatly trimmed short white beard. His face was wrinkled with age, but his eyes were sharp and his movements swift and full of purpose. Behind him came another man who looked to be another one of the house's guards. Like the others, he was a large man with a cold focused stare. He also wore the same black and grey uniform. Black Nail could tell by the warrior's body language that he was subordinate to the white-haired elder. The pair quickly crossed the floor of the room, and drew near their guests. Mahediam politely rose to meet them and Black Nail followed suit, mostly because it made it easier for him to fight or flee. As the mage stepped forward, the hobgoblin fell in behind him in mimicry of the old man's guard. By doing so he made his role obvious, and was thus much more likely to be overlooked. Welcome, you must be Mahediam. Thank you for waiting. I simply had some other business I had to attend to. I'm known as Master Avalis, and that is how you may address me, the older man told the mage. He then reached out and extended a white-gloved hand. After a second of hesitation, Mahediam extended his own arm and they shook hands. Ah, it's a pleasure to meet you, Master Avalis. Pardon me, but you must be the mage I corresponded with, then. Mahediam asked respectfully. Indeed I am. I must say that I'm also glad to meet you. It's been a while since I've had an opportunity to converse with a colleague. Rogue mages with an interest in thaumaturgic research are very rare. The guilds are usually very successful in weeding us out, and of course they're not the only ones who benefit from monopolizing magical knowledge, Avalis said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mahediam's eyes narrowed slightly at the other man's words and tone. They were more than a little suspicious, and Black Nail was sure he detected a hint of threat in them. Yes, well, I'm a skilled combat mage with quite a few powerful crystals at my disposal. I could show them to you if you like. I was also very lucky in coming across Mistress Harad, and in being allowed to join her band. In fact, she expressed interest in this visit herself, and wanted me to tell her all about it as soon as I got back, Mahediam replied dryly. Well then I'd better be on my best behavior, I'd hate for her to think badly of me, the older man said with a faint smile. Black Nail didn't like the older man's grin. He looked like he knew some secret joke no one else was aware of. The hobgoblin hated not getting a joke. He also didn't like what the body language of the old man's guard was telling him. The huge thug's face was calm and unreadable, but his posture betrayed his contempt for his master's guests. Yet, the bodyguard was also looked ready to act at any time, as if he expected a fight of some sort to break out. I feel like sitting, Avorlus then remarked. He snapped his fingers and pointed to a small nearby table. Instantly, the guard by the door hurried over and picked the table up. He rushed over and put it down in front of the older man. Avorlus then pointed to a nearby chair, and the guard brought that over as well. Mahedium nodded and both mages sat down across from each other at the table. Avorlus' guard took up position standing behind his master's chair. Black Nail copied him again, and stood behind Mahedium. Well then, now that we've been properly introduced, feel free to make yourself comfortable. We have much to discuss, the older mage told them. This is a rather nice home you have here, your business must be quite profitable, Mahedium politely commented. It certainly pays the bills and keeps me fed. There's always a demand for elixir in Dagger Point, and the city is short on suppliers. What about you, how are you finding the city? Avorlus replied with a smug grin. Well enough. It's nice to be out from under the guilds, and take destiny into my own hands. There are no lords or guild masters here to exploit me, and tell me what I can and can't learn, the other mage answered. Very true. I myself found them quite stifling as well. Dagger Point of course is not without its own dangers, Avorlus replied. Obviously, you've managed to prosper though, the younger mage remarked. You seem to know a fair bit about my own operations, but I know next to nothing about you. May I inquire as to your own knowledge and background? Your note was intriguing, but severely lacking in detail, Avorlus asked. Now it was Mahedium's turn to smile knowingly. I'm sure there's not much I could tell you that you don't already know. A man so obviously as intelligent and successful as yourself would have already looked into my history as soon as my note arrived. It's also not like my past is a secret. You, on the other hand, are quite the enigma though, the younger mage replied. Straight down to business it is then. When you first contacted me you suggested an exchange of knowledge would be to both our interests. That seems unlikely to me, but I'd like to know what you have to offer anyway. As you've already correctly determined I'm a maker of elixirs, Avorlus said. And you've amassed yourself a fortune, by secretly selling them to bandit chieftains using intermediaries, Mahedium remarked. Avorlus nodded in response, so Mahedium continued speaking. My own area of expertise lies in a different area of research. I specialize in creating spell crystals. I have the skills and knowledge to grow them from scratch, Mahedium told the other man as he reached into his coat. The old mage's guard tensed at Mahedium's movement, but didn't act further. Master Avorlus barely reacted. His fake-looking smile didn't falter at all. The younger mage then pulled out a small pouch and emptied it onto the table. Half a dozen transparent crystals rolled across the table. Avorlus' white eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. They are a gift, from me to you. A token of my respect and an offer of friendship, the younger mage explained. Den of Beasts 9. Master Avorlus reached down and picked the largest stone up with 2 fingers. It was slightly smaller than his closed fist. He stared at it for a second and it pulsed with light. These are all light crystals, the older mage observed impassively. Yes well, since I see that you are using candles to light your home, I think these will be quite useful to you, Mahedium replied. The older man grunted and eyed Mahedium with new interest. Yes, these would be quite useful, but worth elixirs? I don't believe so. You can't compare the ability to uplift mere men into vessels to something that's a small improvement over a candle, he remarked scornfully. Perhaps, but light crystals don't kill most the people who try and use them either, and I have other stones, Mahedium countered. So what if you do? I make more than enough money to buy as many crystals as I want by selling elixirs. Why do I need you? The older mage replied. Mahedium didn't seem concerned by Avorlus' argument. He leaned back in his chair and appeared to relax. You can't use your potions yourself though. You're a mage not a vessel. Are you really satisfied with granting other people power, and not finding ways to make and use magic for yourself? He asked. You're assuming I don't know how to make my own spell stones, Avorlus responded coldly. Black Nail wasn't fooled though. The older man was looking less composed and sure of himself now. Mahedium leaned forward and stared hard into the other mage's eyes. I know you can't, for the same reasons I know you can't actually buy all the crystals you want. This home is lit by candles instead of magic. Where are all the crystals you're supposedly buying? I'll tell you where. They're tucked away somewhere safe, or hidden about your person in case of an emergency. You're never going to use them though, they'll lay there forever. You won't risk wasting them when you can never be sure you'll be able to replace them, and thus you'll never be truly free to use the power that is yours by right, Mahedium explained with calm intensity. The younger mage kept up eye contact with the older mage, as he reached down and picked up one of the spell stones on the table. He concealed it in his closed fist, before it burst to life. The light from the crystal was so strong the shadows of the bones in his hand were visible as light blazed out from between his fingers. Then the light died, and Mahedium dropped the used-up spell stone onto the table. Power that can't be used as one wishes, is not truly power at all, he commented dryly. Avorlus looked away. His teeth were clenched hard together, and he looked unsettled now. Very well, I'm listening. What do you propose? He replied few seconds later in a defeated tone. Let us start by being forthright with each other. We could sit here all day making cryptic comments and never accomplish anything. Instead though, let's put our cards on the table, and see what we have to trade, Mahedium suggested. Avorlus coolly eyed the younger mage for a few seconds, but then nodded. Seeing this, Mahedium continued talking. I have next to no information on the process of creating elixirs, and you do. I can show you the basic techniques for creating spell stones however. What would you be willing to trade for it? He asked. Trade? You're here in my home begging favors from me. I'm an experienced mage and you're nothing but a young upstart. I might teach you something in exchange for the scraps of knowledge you possess, but that doesn't make us equals, Avorlus responded coldly. The old bald-bearded mage then raised a gloved hand to reveal he held a crystal against his palm. Black smoke began to curl and rise menacingly upward from the spell stone. Black Nail really didn't like the look of that, or the smell. It reminded him of rotten eggs. Mahedium tensed at the other mage's actions. His own hand inched towards one of the spell stones concealed up his sleeve. I should warn you that I have a rather large force stone tucked up against my skin right now. If you do anything too sudden I might ignite it, and reduce everything in this room to smithereens, Mahedium told the older mage, as he reached up his sleeve and pulled out a small wand. The end of the rod held a small crystal, and it began to thrum and vibrate. He didn't point it at anyone, but he didn't have to, the message was clear. He wasn't intimidated by the other mage's display. Black Nail got ready to draw his own weapon and fight as well. He would have preferred to flee, but the door was guarded and all the windows were too small to squeeze through. The two mages' eyes met, and they stared defiantly at each other. Then Avorlus chuckled, and smiled humorlessly. You're very determined, I see. Good, maybe you're worth dealing with after all, he remarked. Mahedium's posture relaxed at the other man's words, but he didn't put his wand back away. Black Nail continued to stare at the mage's bodyguard, who was staring right back at him. The hobgoblin wasn't exactly sure what he was going to do if he actually had to fight this massive human, but that didn't stop him glaring menacingly. Avorlus noticed his guest's hostility and sighed dramatically. He then carefully placed his spell stone on the table in front of him. Your turn, he remarked confidently. Mahedium gave the older mage a hard stare, but relented a second later. He tucked his wand back into his sleeve, and out of sight. I think you'll find that I'm willing to do practically anything to increase my knowledge of magic. Now, what are you willing to trade for the basic techniques for creating spell stones? Mahedium asked the other mage. As am I, young mage. Over the years I have collected quite a bit of information on the crystal growing process. I've never had any luck making it work though, the information is incomplete. There are however a few formulas for spells in there that I'm sure would be of great value to you, though. I will exchange this knowledge for the basic techniques you've acquired, Avorlus offered carefully. I would have to look it over before agreeing to anything, was Mahedium's answer. I will allow you to read a sample of the writings beforehand, Avorlus told him. Acceptable, but there are other areas I'm interested in as well, the younger mage replied. Avorlus tensed slightly and leaned backwards. The hostile look from earlier returned to his eyes. Mahedium didn't seem surprised or concerned though. You have nothing valuable enough to trade for my knowledge of elixirs, the older man replied coldly. So I understand, but I'm not asking for anything like all your knowledge. I simply need to be able to create one specific formula, that which my leader Herad uses. She requires a new source of the Resertine elixir, and has tasked me with procuring it for her. Your business would remain undisturbed, Mahedium explained. Do you have anything to offer me for this? If not, then she'll just have to purchase it from me like everyone else. I'm not afraid of the bandit chiefs, Avorlus told him coldly. Mahedium rubbed his chin thoughtfully, and looked off to one side for a second. I have some unique vessel samples you might be interested in. They come from a rather interesting source, he told the other man. They would have to be very interesting indeed. Avorlus remarked doubtfully. Oh, they are. Black Nail, would you please remove your hood? Mahedium asked. From where he was standing behind his chair, the hobgoblin gave the mage a curious look. He didn't really want to reveal himself in such a plain manner. It wasn't fun enough. Everyone was now looking his way, and Avorlus looked caught between curiosity and confusion. Now, please, Mahedium requested impatiently, but with a trace of humor. Black Nail sighed, but then did as he was told. He flipped his hood down, and then gave the guard across from him a broad toothy smile. The reaction was immediate. Avorlus flinched away from him, and his guard went for his sword. Fuck me, the guard whispered to himself. This caused Black Nail's smile to widen. He had won the game, and made the stupid human say something aloud. Mahedium calmly reached into his sleeve and withdrew the small wand again, which he pointed at the guard. There's no need for violence, he's friendly as long as you are. However, if you attempt to raise your blade against him, then he'll be the least of your worries, because I'll blast you across the room so fast you won't know what hit you, Mahedium told them. What is this thing that you've brought into my home? Avorlus asked in shock. His eyes were wide with alarm, and his wrinkled face and grown paler. Black Nail hissed in annoyance at the man's tone and words. It was more than a little insulting. The older mage's hand had also slipped into one of his pockets where it was clenching something. Black Nail was sure it was a weapon or spell stone of some sort. It's a hobgoblin, and also a vessel. He's the sample I was talking about before. Introduce yourself, Black Nail, Mahedium said. Hello. I promise not to kill you, or other bad things, Black Nail told them cheerfully. Avorlus continued to stare in shock at Black Nail. He didn't seem reassured. See? He's actually a rather nice fellow when you get to know him, Mahedium added with a smile of his own. Avorlus turned his attention to the younger mage, and then seemed to relax and regain his composure. He made a waving motion at the guard behind him, and the other man relaxed as well. It's a vessel, you say? Any idea which elixir? The older mage asked with obvious interest. I'm a he, not an it, Black Nail told the man with forced smile. I have no idea, but the blood work I did was conclusive. I was hoping you could tell us more, Mahedium answered. I must admit to never seeing a non-human vessel before. I've heard of them of course, though. Some of the guilds create hunting dogs or war horses, but they're the play toys of the high nobility. How did he become a vessel, and why do you think I will be interested in studying him? Avorlus asked. That's an interesting question. Black Nail was originally picked up by one of Herod's men when they liberated him from a caravan, which just happened to have been guarded by a mage. From which guild? Avorlus asked curiously. I'm getting to that. It was before I joined, but Herod actually keeps records of everything she procures and sells. She also had some papers from the merchants themselves. From descriptions of the mage and the records I was able to determine that he was attached to that caravan in order to guard a shipment of materials for his guild, the Purple Hearts, Mahedium explained. I see, the goblin was part of the cargo, Avorlus whispered to himself, as an excited grin broke out on his wrinkled face. Black Nail didn't see, or understand either. What were these mages talking about? Indeed, the Purple Heart Guild is known for its work on non-human vessels, Mahedium remarked. Why would they experiment in order to create a goblin vessel, though? Avorlus mused. Why do the guilds do anything? I've heard the Purple Hearts have an elixir for house cats. Goblin vessels seem sane compared to that, Mahedium replied with a roll of his eyes. True, it was probably just some student's thesis project, which turned out to be an unexpected success. Was the goblin the only thing of interest from the caravan? The older mage asked. No, when she raided the caravan Herod captured some other wares that I believe were also their work. She didn't think much of them and neither did any of her buyers, so they were still sitting around her base camp when I joined, Mahedium remarked. You have them, here, the older gentleman asked with eyes that shone with hunger. Of course, naturally I collected everything that even hinted at magic when I joined. At the time though, couldn't figure out what any of it was, so I dismissed it as useless. With your help though, and knowing that one of the samples is probably an elixir for Black Nail, the younger mage explained. Reverse engineering an elixir is not an easy task. The elixir itself is far more than the sum of its parts. Once the mage blood is added it becomes active, and is completely transformed, Avorlus explained. In the same way a crystal is grown from a mineral base and mage's blood, Mahedium commented. Black Nail frowned in frustration as he realized what the mages had just said. You needed mage blood to make elixirs. That ruined his plan to find out how to make it for himself, and not be reliant on Mahedium for his magic. You're asking for time-tested knowledge, in exchange for nothing but possibilities, their bearded host said. True, but I'm only asking for very basic knowledge that costs you nothing. If you're nearly as good an alchemist as you seem to be then you should be able to reverse engineer the Purple Heart's work. Think about what you would get from that, cutting-edge guild research. A brand new unknown elixir, Mahedium countered. Black Nail grinned as an idea occurred to him. Scamp was a mage, right? He could just use his blood. The little troublemaker undoubtedly had more blood than he was using anyway. You're playing me like a flute, Avorlus told the other mage with a dramatic sigh. We're simply engaging in an exchange. You're losing nothing, the other mage replied with a smile. We'll see. I agree to both of the deals. I'd like to start as soon as possible. Come back tomorrow morning, and I'll have a lab set up, their host told Mahedium. The other mage nodded, stood up, and then extended a hand. The two men shook, and then after a few brief words one of the guards escorted them out. They had no more trouble from their hosts on the way out. That was good because Avorlus' smoke crystal had apparently ended up in Black Nail's pocket. Black Nail wasn't sure how, it wasn't like he wanted the smelly thing. As Black Nail and Mahedium walked back down the pathway that led to the iron gate and off the property, the hobgoblin considered what had just happened. Black Nail led the way towards the house where Herod was waiting. Just in case things had gone badly she had brought some men and they were waiting nearby. As they moved onto a deserted street, the hobgoblin heard several people step out of an alley onto the road behind them. He turned around to get a look at them and saw that they were thugs, like those that could be found all over Dagger Point. This was the central district though, and groups of a dozen men such as them were very rare here. Black Nail was too paranoid to think their presence was just a coincidence. Then one of the men raised a crossbow, and Black Nail's eyes went wide in alarm. He tackled Mahedium and threw both the mage and himself to the ground, just as a crossbow bolt zoomed past them. They hit the cobblestones hard, and Mahedium grunted in surprise and pain. What's going on? The mage wheezed. Enemies, and a crossbow. Black Nail hissed angrily, as he scrambled back to his feet. He didn't like being ambushed. That was his thing, he did the ambushing, not the other way around. The man with the crossbow began to load it again, and his companions drew their own weapons and rushed towards Black Nail and Mahedium. The hobgoblin immediately began looking for somewhere to run. There was no way he could fight so many humans. He would also probably have to leave Mahedium behind. As Black Nail was planning his escape, Mahedium pushed himself up onto his knees. Then the mage leveled his staff at the armed thugs racing towards him. The crystal at the end glowed orange, and its power exploded out. The thugs between Mahedium and the crossbowman were knocked backwards and caught fire. The crossbowman himself was instantly set ablaze. Several of the attackers died instantly, but they were the lucky ones. Screams of pain filled the air as some of the other flaming thugs began flailing around in pain and panic. The smell of roasting meat filled the corpse-littered street. The remaining unharmed attackers stopped and looked stunned, before deciding to make a run for it. They all quickly dashed out of sight. They didn't want to risk meeting the same fate as their companions. Mahedium was looking at the destruction he had wrought with a satisfied look on his face. The question is whether these were Warwick's men, or if Avorlus sent them, the mage mused aloud. Think later. We need to go, now. Black Nail hissed. He heard yelling off in the distance. He was pretty sure it was the governor's men coming to investigate the disturbance. Quickly, the hobgoblin grabbed Mahedium and began dragging the mage towards Herat and the rest of the band. Mahedium had surprised him. He was far more clever and dangerous than he usually pretended to be. He acted so clueless sometimes that it was easy to forget all the power he had at his fingertips. Black Nail wondered if the man was hiding his real self, or if he had simply risen to the occasion. Regardless, the hobgoblin planned to keep an eye on him. If only to make sure they never became enemies, and so he could find out the man's weaknesses if they ever did. Interlude, Depths of Despair. The leafy branch shifted as he pushed it out of the way, and the man's efforts were rewarded by the sight of his destination. Up ahead, through several paces of thick forest, stood the claim marker. It was little more than a post with a long piece of red cloth tied to it, but it did its job. Beside the marker he would find the cave they'd discovered last month. He could still remember it like it had been yesterday. While out surveying the hills, he and his partner had stumbled across the opening. After a brief debate they had risked a brief foray inside, and they hadn't been disappointed by what they'd found within. Stop standing there and blocking the way, El Red. There are people behind you, and they don't want to stand in the middle of the woods just so you can take in the scenery, a deep voice said from behind him. El Red sighed in annoyance, but started walking forward again. When he had stepped out from beneath the forest canopy and into the sun he turned around, and watched the rest of his party emerge from the trees. Why didn't you take the lead if you're in such a hurry, Disleith? He asked his partner. Because if someone was going to walk into a mimic or a troll I didn't want it to be me, Disleith replied with a chuckle. Elred rolled his eyes in annoyance. He had been partnered with Disleith for over a decade, and the man's sense of humor was still as annoying as ever. I scouted this path just a few minutes ago. No one is in any danger of walking into a mimic, and you don't walk into trolls. You won't see one until it attacks, and then it will pick out the weakest target, their guide Kotha interjected. Hear that, Elred? That means it would definitely attack you, Disleith remarked. Haha, you're hilarious, Elred replied in a distracted manner as he scanned the nearby rocks. Don't even joke about trolls. Mimics or goblins are one thing, but trolls are another. If you guys weren't paying so well I wouldn't have left Koroulus, one of the miners added, as he walked out of the woods and into the clearing. Soon everyone had gathered in the rocky clearing around the claim marker. A huge pile of stones dominated the middle of the forest clearing. Tall trees and thick greenery surrounded them on every side, but the sky above was blue and clear. There were around a dozen people in their group, and 7 pack mules. As Elred watched, everyone began settling down. Packs were discarded, and animals were tied up. Most of them were hand-picked men from the Surveyors Guild. That meant they had all signed a contract that acknowledged this claim belonged to Elred and his partner. Guild men were expensive, but they were worth it because using them prevented claim jumping and theft. Kotha was their guide, and was holding up the rear of the group. She was an average-sized woman with a lean hard cast to her features, and long brown hair that was tied back in a ponytail. Elred and his partner had debated hiring her, since she wasn't strictly necessary to find the claim. In the end, Elred had convinced his partner that they could afford her and an expert on the forest would make the trip much safer. Having her around had certainly reassured him. Running into a troll was unlikely this close to civilization, but not impossible. The last member of their party was a mage from the Earthbreakers. The Mage Guild had a deal with the Surveyors, and was informed every time a new cavern system was discovered. The mage's name was Saraj, and he was apparently a specialist in exploring the dark paths. The man seemed agreeable enough, and would probably end up being useful. Elred hoped the mage ended up disappointed with their trip, though. The only reason he was here was to search for crystals, and if he found any it would make their trip a lot more dangerous. Mining in caves that possibly connected to the dark paths was bad enough, while mining near crystals was almost suicide. We may as well set up here, Disleith remarked, as he started unpacking his bag. The group of miners then spent the next hour helping set up their camp. When they were done Elred called a meeting, and they began discussing exploring the cave. I'll be staying up here. You hired me to guide you through forest, not underground, Kotha told them. Oh come on. It's not really any more dangerous down there than in the forest, Disleith exclaimed in exasperation. The forest is my home, the deeps aren't, she replied. Disleith looked like he wanted to argue, but Eldred cut him off. That's fine, Kotha. It's a good idea to have someone patrolling the woods, anyway. Just make sure nothing dangerous wanders into camp, he told her. She gave a brief nod and then turned away. Disleith was scowling, but Eldith ignored him. There was no point in forcing Kotha to enter the cave with them. Lanterns and rope were then taken out and passed around. Last but hardly least, most of the party armed themselves with hooked spears. They were the weapon of choice for fighting underground. Hidden among the rocks behind the marker was a crack in the earth. The miners approached the opening and gazed down into it. It wasn't that deep. You could jump down to the bottom and easily climb out, even if the tight walls and rocky bottom made that a stupid idea. On the far side of the pit was the actual entrance to the cave though. It was a dark crack in the wall that led deeper under the earth. From where Elred was standing it didn't look like there had been a collapse or anything, not that he'd expected there to have been one. A quick look around also failed to turn up any signs of bears or other unwanted wildlife. The first thing we'll have to do is fix up this entrance, it's much too hard to get in and out of the crack, Disleith remarked as he stared down into the chasm. We'll throw some dirt down there to make a ramp, and maybe widen the cave mouth. First let's get this initial sweep over with, Elred responded. His partner nodded and then climbed down into the chasm. When he reached the bottom a few seconds later, one of the men threw him a lantern. Desolate lit it, and then one by one the group started down after him. As Elred jumped down, his partner stepped into the cave mouth and out of sight. It was a tight fit in the chasm, the rocky walls pressed into Elred from both sides. Rocks scrapped against him as he pushed forward after his partner and the rest of their group. As he stepped into the rocky maw, the light of the sun vanished and everything grew dark. All he could see was the flickering lantern lights ahead of him, and the flashes of light they cast on the cavern walls. When his vision had adjusted, Elred was greeted by the sight of a twisting rock corridor. By the light of the lanterns, the grey walls of the cave seemed to have a reddish cast to them. The sound of water dripping could be heard echoing from further in, and the air was moist and warm. The rest of his party was strung out in front of him, and at the very front was Desolate with a lantern. He was standing beside the mage, and seemed to be conversing with him. After a few seconds, Sarich nodded and pulled out a lantern of his own. This one, however, wasn't full of oil, but held a crystal instead. It flared to life, and the cave was suddenly illuminated by steady bright white light. Desolate smiled and snuffed out his own lantern. The cavern looked very different now. The crystal light was much brighter, and made everything look paler instead of red. It also didn't create any smoke, which was definitely a good thing. The party resumed moving forward at a slow pace. The prize was still a bit further in, and Elred was excited to lay his eyes on it again, but he also didn't want to die. Moving quickly while underground was a good way to get yourself killed. Feeling impatient, Elred moved his way up the line and next to his partner and the mage. They had both stopped walking, and were scanning the shadows between the stalagmites that hung from the ceiling. Desolate then turned around and addressed one of the men behind him. "Pass me your spear, please," he told the miner. Immediately, the man's spear was tossed up to Desolate, who caught it out of the air. He then aimed it upwards at the ceiling. A second later he stabbed at something behind one of the stalagmites, and there was a hissing noise. When Desolate's partner withdrew the spear, there was a wriggling form impaled on the tip. Tentacles waved madly through the air and the thing flopped around uselessly for a few seconds, before going limp. The creature looked like a large grey octopus, but with a thick wing-like membrane stretching between all its limbs. "I see you've killed our expedition's first stone strangler," Elred remarked, as he joined the mage and his partner. "It's just a small one, barely an adult, see," Desolate responded as he swung the spear towards Elred. "Hey, watch it!" Elred exclaimed as the spear tip and the dead creature were shoved towards his face. "Don't worry, it's very dead," his partner said with a humorous grin. "Yay, but you could still take my eye out with that thing," Elred replied, as he pushed the spear away and frowned in annoyance. Some of the miners they hired were giving the stone strangler nervous looks. So of course, Desolate waved the corpse in their direction. "It's just a stone strangler. It's only really dangerous if it lands on your head and suffocates you to death, before someone else can cut it off of you," he told them. Sarich turned towards Desolate. He had an unamused look on his face. "You're right, there are much worse things down here in the depths than stone stranglers. So, let's not let it distract us from other threats. We need to stay focused," the mage told them. "Good luck with that, because there's the first of the gold," Desolate replied smugly as he pointed deeper down into the cavern. Instantly, everyone went silent and looked that way. They all peered past each other expectantly. The only one that was looking was Elred. He could have sworn he'd heard something move behind him, but he didn't see anything there among the rocks and shadows. It was probably just water. Sarich held his lantern up, and golden veins suddenly shone brightly across the cavern wall, and formed intricate mesmerizing patterns. It was beautiful. "Thank the gods," someone mumbled. Everyone now had stupid grins on their faces. The only person who didn't seem particularly happy was the mage. In fact, he was scowling in displeasure. "Alright, that's enough. It's not going anywhere. We need to continue scouting down this passage before anyone can get to mining. If it leads down into the dark paths, I might have to seal it," Sarich told them all. "And we need to see if there's any more gold down there as well," Desolate added with a mischievous grin. After everyone's fascination with the gold had worn off, they reluctantly moved on and continued on deeper into the cave. Soon, they reached the deepest reaches that Elred and Desolate had entered. When they had first scouted the passage, it had been bare and mostly empty of anything but rock. That wasn't the case anymore. Piles of dirt lay around the place, and mushrooms were growing from them. "No wonder there was a strangler so close to the entrance. While we were gone, harvesters have moved in," Elred remarked. The air was heavy with moisture here, and smelled slightly of compost. It wasn't a terrible smell, but it wasn't a good one either. "Yay, that's not good," Desolate added as he looked around. "They're just harvesters. The bugs are completely harmless," one of the miners said. "They might be completely harmless, but not all the things that come to eat their mushrooms are, and the things that come to eat those things certainly aren't," Elred explained. Sarich nodded in agreement as he raised his crystal lantern up over his head, and scanned the surroundings. The light glinted off the shell of the occasional harvester that was busy working among the mushrooms, or that had taken flight. "Them being here makes it far more likely that this cave leads to the dark paths as well. Let's hope the passage is small and easy to seal," the mage added. One of the miners approached one of the harvester mounds and was studying it. Suddenly, he yelped and fell backwards. The soil in front of him roiled and a small thin crab-like creature unburied itself, and swiftly scuttled away. "It's just a lurker. They're harmless unless you're a rodent," Elred said in relief. Several of the other miners chuckled at their fallen companion, whose face had turned red in embarrassment. Sarge threw them all a disapproving glare and they grew quiet. The mage then started walking forward again, so everyone reluctantly followed him. The twisting passages they moved through continued to be full of harvesters and their mounds. Twice they had to stop to spear stone stranglers that lurked up in the shadows of the uneven ceiling. They didn't however find any more gold, much to Disleith's disappointment. Elred was fine with that though. There was more than enough of the stuff near the entrance to set them up for life, if they managed to get it home. How much longer are we going to explore? He asked the mage. Because this is just more of the same, rocky stone passages full of dirt mushrooms and bugs. It looks like the way forward widens significantly up ahead. We'll see what's there, and then decide, the mage replied as he continued walking. Elred sighed, and shared a knowing look with Disleith. The bloody mage was probably looking for trouble, and hoping to find some signs of crystals. Everyone else was happy with the gold, but apparently not Sarge. Elred really hoped the mage didn't find anything up ahead. The sound of dripping water grew stronger as they moved carefully forward, until Elred realized why. The natural chamber up ahead of them was much wider than the passage they'd just come from, and in the center lay a pond-sized pool of crystal clear water. Long stalagmites reached down from the roof. Several of them reached all the way down to the ground, and formed smooth stone pillars. Just with a quick glance around, Elred was able to see at least 2 side passages that led deeper underground, and probably to the dark paths. The entire chamber echoed with the hypnotic sound of lapping water, and falling droplets. The only other noise was the rasping breath of the newly arrived men. The floor of the chamber was several feet below them, and its smooth layered surface had obviously been worn down by water over countless ages. Well, isn't that something? Disleith remarked with a hint of awe in his voice. I wonder if any other human has ever set his eyes on this before, Elred mused aloud. Sarge just grunted in reply. He then raised his lantern high and it flared brighter than ever. The white light burned the shadows from the chamber ahead of them, and revealed its hidden contents. Tall bumps scattered across the floor that Elred had taken to be rocks or natural formations were actually alive. There were dozens of the creatures, and each one of them was the size of a large dog. The light seemed to startle them because the closest ones started moving. 6 long legs stuck out from a body that resembled a gigantic insect or crab. Their grey shells were curved and spiky in a way that helped them camouflage with the stone. 2 huge wicked-looking pincers extended out from the front of the beasts. Cave crabs, they're nasty if you get close to them, but not man-eaters. Unless you're already dead, that is, Elred said. Yay, this looks like the perfect place to seal the tunnel. It's a shame though, that we won't be able to see this ever again, Disleith remarked. Elred was just about to reply when he noticed Sarge was staring intently at the center of the chamber, and the pool of water there. He followed the mage's gaze and didn't see anything at first, but then the water rippled ominously. Something large and pale glided through it. What is it? Elred asked the mage nervously. Sarge didn't reply, he just watched the pool. The other members of the party began to mutter amongst themselves in alarm. Then a massive white creature dragged itself out of the water. It was long, longer than a man was tall, even if you didn't include the tail it was dragging behind it. Its skin was practically transparent, it was so pale, and veins could be seen running beneath it. It was a huge salamander. It crawled across the cavern floor on 4 short legs, but it moved smoothly and with grace. Its long snout was pointed in their direction, and it was clearly headed their way. Its tongue flickered in and out of its mouth, which opened to reveal row upon rows of tiny razor-sharp teeth. A pair of gills ran along the side of its neck, but the most startling thing about it was its eyes. It didn't have any. Its skull was completely smooth where they should have been, and yet it was swiftly and unerringly racing towards them. Okay, that's dangerous. I've never seen one of those, Disleith remarked nervously. It's a blind hunter, and yes, it's very dangerous. This one shouldn't be too much of a problem though. Creatures such as it are at their most dangerous when you don't see them coming, Sarge remarked. The mage then passed Disleith his light, and raised his staff. He aimed the end of it towards the salamander that was stalking towards them. A second later the air rippled and a bolt of force shot out towards the blind hunter. The magical attack missed the salamander, but slammed into the ground beside it. Bits of rock flew through the air, and a loud cracking sound reverberated through the cavern. The attacking salamander was thrown off its feet and sent flying into a nearby stone pillar, as a wave of air washed over the watchers. The noise startled the cave crabs, and they began running for shelter. Several dashed into the water and disappeared, while others hid among the rocks. The salamander itself lay prone and unmoving. See, as long as you don't let them sneak up on you, they're not a real problem, the mage told the others as he grinned smugly. That was when Elred heard a scuttling sound on the rocks below them. His first thought was that the noise was probably a cave crab. He leaned over the ledge at his feet to check. A rather large cave crab was climbing up the rocks, and headed in their direction. He sighed with relief, when he realized that it wasn't anything worse. Wait. The cave crab was rather large, it probably weighed as much a man, and it had an odd purplish tint to its carapace. In fact, it kind of looked like it had bits of crystal growing on it. Shit, mutant crab, Elred yelled in panic as he backed away. Get back, all of you, Sarge yelled as he stepped forward. He almost seemed excited at the presence of the mutant. Fucking mages, and their obsession with crystals. No one needed to be told twice. The miners and their 2 employers hurried back into the passage behind them. The mage himself took a few steps back. He then waited for the monster to pull itself up over the ledge, so he could get a clear shot with his staff. Just as the creature reached the top, it lunged at Sarge, and he fired his staff. The bolt of force hit the mutant head-on. It seemed to hang in the air for a second, with its claws extended and its legs dangling below it, until the moment ended and the creature ruptured. Purple flames burst out from its crumbling shell and washed over the mage. Sarich had no time to protect himself. There was a brief scream before he vanished behind the curtain of fire. The cave rumbled and bits of rock fell around them. Elred looked up in alarm. The cave was collapsing. Run! Disleith yelled as he took off towards safety. Everyone else was right behind him. Luckily, Disleith still had the mage's lantern and it lit their way. They all ran madly towards the exit as the flames and falling rocks chased them. The sound of shifting stone was overpowering now, and the air was hot and dry. One of the men beside Elred tripped and fell. No one had any time to help him, or even look back. Up ahead the exit came into sight, and daylight streamed through the opening. The rumbling behind them seemed to have stopped, but everyone was still too terrified to stop running. They couldn't all fit through the entrance at the same time though, so Elred slowed. Disleith had already reached the exit, but he'd also stopped there and was lighting the way for the others. As the men in front of him fought to get outside, Elred addressed his partner. "Let's get the hells out of here," he said. Disleith nodded in agreement. "We can come back later and see if the cavern is stable." "Hopefully, that God's cursed explosion sealed that chamber and it's safe now," he replied. Elred coughed as he inhaled dust that had been thrown into the air by the explosion, and then hurried through the now empty opening. Once outside he took a second to bask in the bright sunlight and fresh air. The sound of leaves blowing in the wind could be heard in the distance. Relief washed through him, he'd had more than enough of caves for a while. As he pulled himself up out of the chasm he looked around and relaxed. His muscles were tight and sore from all the frantic activity. Where were the other men, though? They'd been right in front of him. There was the slightest whisper of sound from behind him, but before he could turn around his head was thrown forward as something smashed into it from behind. Elred gasped in pain as he staggered, and then collapsed limply onto the ground. Confused but still lucid, he tried to move but couldn't manage more than a loose flop. Something grabbed his ankles and began to drag him out of sight behind a rock. To his horror a pile of bodies lay there. All the miners had been ambushed as they'd rushed out of the cave and climbed out of the chasm, just like him. Even Kotha's body lay there, and it wasn't a pretty sight. Most her clothes had been ripped off and the flesh underneath had been mutilated. Elred felt a wave of horror and despair wash over him at the sight. What the hell had done all this? Why couldn't he move? As he struggled desperately to overcome his paralysis, he was suddenly released. A pair of green feet then descended and filled his vision. They were quickly followed by the leering face of a yellow-eyed hobgoblin, as it leaned over him. It grinned wickedly as it reached over him with one of its clawed hands. Elred couldn't even scream as it ripped out his eyes, just choke and squirm mutely. "Elred, where'd you go?" Disleith's voice rang out. It was the last thing Elred ever heard.